My fiancé's father raised his crystal champagne flute and looked down his nose at my parents. He told a room full of high society elites that a girl from my street garbage origins should be on her knees thanking his son for elevating my bloodline. He completely forgot that my signature controlled the $730,000 corporate contract, currently keeping his precious historic estate out of foreclosure. That was his fatal mistake. The clinking of heavy sterling silver against fine bone china echoed through the grand dining hall of Wellington Estates. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck aged Burgundy and the suffocating perfume of generational wealth. I sat perfectly straight in my tailored silk engagement dress, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I am 34 years old. My name is Caroline. I am the Senior Director of Corporate Events for one of the largest Fortune 500 logistics firms in Chicago. I built my career from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail for every promotion, every raise, and every ounce of respect. But tonight, in this room, dripping with crystal chandeliers and gilded oil paintings, none of that mattered. To them, I was just the farm girl who somehow tricked their golden boy into putting a ring on her finger. Across the massive mahogany table sat my parents. My father wore the only suit he owned, a slightly faded charcoal two-piece he had bought for my college graduation. My mother wore her best Sunday dress, her rough, calloused hands folded nervously in her lap. They were honest, hardworking people who had spent their entire lives running a corn and soybean farm in rural Illinois. They had sacrificed everything to put me through college, teaching me the value of $1 and the importance of unwavering integrity. I loved them more than anything in the world. Seeing them sit there looking so small and out of place among my future in-laws made my heart ache with a fierce protective instinct. Spencer sat next to me. He was 35, incredibly handsome, and possessed that effortless charm that only comes from a lifetime of extreme privilege. When we first met, he seemed different from the rest of his family. He was attentive, supportive, and always told me how much he admired my relentless work ethic. I was swept off my feet by his sweet words and quickly agreed to be his partner. I trusted him completely. I trusted our relationship, believing that we were a team, building a beautiful future together based on mutual respect and shared goals. But I knew his capabilities all too well. While he played the part of the successful and wealthy heir, the reality was that his family's legacy, Wellington Estates, was bleeding money and drowning in secret debt. I knew this because I was the one secretly keeping them afloat. Just a month ago, Spencer had come to me in a total panic, his face pale and his hands shaking violently. He confessed that his father, Richard, had drastically mismanaged the estate's finances for years. The sprawling property was heavily mortgaged, the taxes were delinquent, and the bank was actively threatening foreclosure. Out of love for my fiancé and a desperate desire to protect our future family, I had agreed to step in and save them. I spent weeks battling my own board of directors, pulling every string and leveraging every ounce of my professional reputation to move our company's annual executive summit from a luxury resort in Las Vegas to Wellington Estates. It was a massive $730,000 contract. The deposit alone was more than enough to cover their immediate debts, satisfy the bank, and keep the financial wolves at bay. I handled every major and minor detail so Spencer and his father could save face and keep their historic property intact. I did not want any recognition. I just wanted to secure the foundation of my new marriage. I genuinely thought tonight was supposed to be a celebration of our union. I thought that securing that massive corporate contract would finally earn me a shred of basic human respect from Richard. I was incredibly naive. The dinner had been an agonizing exercise in endurance. Richard, a man of 65, with a pompous posture and a perpetually sneering expression, sat at the head of the table holding court. Throughout the first two courses, he made a point to loudly discuss trust funds, Ivy League legacies, and summer homes in Martha's Vineyard, topics specifically designed to exclude and humiliate my parents. My mother just smiled politely and nodded while my father kept his eyes firmly fixed on his plate, I squeezed Spencer's leg under the table, silently begging him to intervene to change the subject, to defend the people who gave me life. But Spencer just awkwardly sipped his wine and looked away. Then came the moment for the toasts. Richard stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The room of 50 wealthy relatives and country club elites immediately fell silent. He tapped his spoon against his crystal flute. He cleared his throat, his face flushed from the expensive scotch he had been downing all evening. He was drunk on his own perceived superiority. "I would like to say a few words." Richard began, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. He did not look at me. He looked directly at my parents. Marriage is a merging of legacies. It is the joining of bloodlines. For generations, the Wellington name has stood for excellence, for prestige, for the highest echelons of civilized society. He took a slow sip of his champagne, letting the silence stretch out to build his dramatic effect. Then he turned his cold, judgmental eyes toward me. "And then, we have Caroline." The way he said my name made it sound like a disease. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a rapid, frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears. Spencer came to me a year ago and told me he had found someone from the heartland. Richard continued, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. He told me she was a hard worker, a girl who knew how to pull herself up by her bootstraps because she had absolutely nothing else to rely on. No pedigree, no inheritance, no class. My mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. Richard raised his glass higher, leaning forward to ensure every single person in the room could hear his next words with crystal clarity. "I suppose we must applaud her ambition. But let us not pretend we are equals here today. A girl like you, Caroline, coming from such obvious street garbage origins, should be on your knees every single morning, thanking God that my son is even interested in you. We are not just giving you a wedding. We are elevating your bloodline. We are rescuing you from mediocrity. You should be eternally grateful that we are allowing you to dilute our family tree." A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down on the dining room. No one moved. No one spoke. Some of the older aunts and uncles exchanged amused, knowing glances. A few of Spencer's cousins openly smirked thoroughly, enjoying the spectacle of the working-class girl being put in her rightful place. I sat completely frozen. The humiliation was a physical force crashing into me like a tidal wave. The blood rushed to my face, a vein throbbing painfully in my temple. I looked at my parents. My father's eyes were glistening with unshed tears of shame and suppressed rage. My mother was shaking her head, bowed in absolute humiliation. They had driven 8 hours in an old pickup truck to be here bringing jars of homemade preserves as gifts for these people, only to be publicly slaughtered for the crime of not being born rich. I turned desperately to Spencer, expecting him to leap out of his chair. I expected the man who promised to protect me to shout at his father, to defend my honor, to throw his napkin on the table and walk out with me hand in hand. But Spencer did nothing. He shrank into his chair, avoiding my desperate gaze. "Spencer," I whispered, my voice cracking with disbelief. "Do something. Say something." He leaned in close to my ear, his breath reeking of red wine, and whispered back. "He is just traditional, babe. He has had a lot to drink. Please do not make a scene. Just let it go. We need his blessing. Do not make a scene. Let it go." Those words were the catalyst. They were the spark that ignited a massive, uncontrollable inferno deep inside my soul. In that singular fraction of a second, the naive, enduring, submissive woman I had been trying to be for the last 2 years completely vanished. I did not cry. My eyes were bone dry. The agonizing pain and public humiliation instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating chill that settled deep into my bones. At 34, after a decade of wrestling with ruthless corporate executives and navigating high-stakes financial negotiations, I had forged a very cool head. I felt a crushing weight in my chest, but it was not sorrow. It was the absolute clarity of betrayal. Spencer was gaslighting me. He was willing to let his father publicly crucify my parents just to maintain his comfortable facade. They thought I was just a foolish, desperate farm girl desperate for a wealthy husband. They thought I was a pathetic, subservient woman who would swallow any insult to be part of their glittering world. They thought I was a stepping stone, a convenient corporate ATM to bail out their sinking ship. I looked at the coffee stains spreading across my pristine white pantsuit, a metaphor for the mess they were making of my life. No, there was no coffee stain here, but the metaphorical stain on my dignity was exactly the same. I slowly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, placing it perfectly beside my plate. My hands stopped shaking. My heart stopped its frantic hammering, settling into a slow, deliberate, predatory rhythm. I stood up. The scraping of my chair cut through the heavy silence like a gunshot. All eyes immediately snapped to me. Richard lowered his glass, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second, expecting me to burst into hysterical tears and run out of the room. Spencer reached up and grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin. "Caroline, sit down," he hissed through his teeth. "You are embarrassing yourself." I pulled my arm out of his grasp with such violent force that his hand slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Richard. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim, romantic lighting of the dining hall. I calmly opened my corporate vendor management application. The interface loaded, instantly displaying the active contracts for the upcoming fiscal quarter. Right at the top of the list was the authorization file for the Wellington Estates Executive Summit. Status approved. Amount $730,000. I tapped the screen, opening the authorization panel. "Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a senior executive about to terminate a very bad investment. The room held its breath, straining to hear every word. Richard narrowed his eyes, gripping the edge of the table. "What are you doing, Caroline?" "I am giving a toast. Have you no manners? You speak of legacies and bloodlines." I continued, my thumb hovering directly over the digital cancellation button. "You speak of elevating me from the street garbage. But you seem to suffer from a severe case of financial amnesia. You seem to have forgotten exactly who is currently funding the electricity, illuminating this beautiful crystal chandelier above your head." Richard's face twitched. A murmur rippled through the guests. Spencer stood up abruptly, his face suddenly draining of all color as he realized exactly what application I had open on my phone. "Caroline, stop!" Spencer pleaded, his voice cracking with sudden raw panic. "What are you doing with your phone? Put it away." I ignored him completely. I pressed the red button on my screen. "Cancel contract." A confirmation prompt appeared. "Are you sure you want to terminate this vendor agreement?" "Yes." The screen flashed green. Contract terminated. Funds recalled. I locked my phone and dropped it back into my purse with a soft final thud. I looked Richard dead in the eye, watching the arrogance slowly melt off his face, replaced by a creeping cold dread. "Since my street garbage money is not quite good enough for your pristine, elevated bloodline," I announced, my voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened scalpel, "I have just officially canceled the corporate summit contract. The $730,000 has been pulled from your escrow account. It will reflect on your ledger by tomorrow morning." Richard stumbled backward, bumping into his chair. His crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers, hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound echoed like a judge's gavel. What Richard gasped, clutching his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You cannot do that. That contract is finalized. We have an agreement. I am the Senior Director of Corporate Events, Richard. I own the approval matrix. I can do whatever I want." I replied, offering him a smile that was completely devoid of any warmth. "I suggest you call your bank first thing tomorrow. I hear their foreclosure department is very unforgiving this time of year. Good luck with your mortgage." I turned to my parents, who were staring at me in absolute shock. "Mom? Dad, get your coats. We are leaving this dump." I did not wait for them to respond. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the grand double doors of the dining hall. The crowd of wealthy relatives instinctively parted for me, their faces painted with utter horror and disbelief. They were no longer looking at a farm girl. They were looking at the executioner of their family legacy. "Caroline, wait!" Spencer yelled, his footsteps pounding behind me as he chased me into the lavish foyer. He grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. "You cannot do this to us. My father was just drunk. You are destroying my family. You are destroying our wedding." I looked at the man I had planned to spend the rest of my life with. I saw him not as a partner, but as a cowardly parasite who had been willing to feed me to the wolves. "There is no wedding, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I would rather be street garbage than be legally tied to a family of bankrupt, pathetic leeches. Do not ever contact me again." I walked out the heavy oak doors into the cool Chicago night air. The valet brought my car around. I helped my trembling parents into the back seat, got behind the wheel, and drove away from Wellington Estates without looking back a single time. The peace that followed the storm was merely the calm before the tsunami. The war had just begun. The heavy, suffocating silence in the dining room pressed down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching my father stare blankly at his empty dessert plate. His large, calloused hands were gripping his napkins so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. My mother was trembling beside him, her eyes fixed firmly on her lap, unable to look at the dozens of wealthy strangers staring at us with mocking amusement. Spencer sat to my left. His hand was wrapped around my wrist, squeezing it in a silent command to stay in my place. He leaned closer to me, and the sharp smell of aged burgundy on his breath made my stomach turn. He told me again to just let it go, to not make a scene. He told me his father was just being traditional, and that I needed to swallow my pride for the sake of our future. In that exact moment, the last remaining shred of my blind devotion to this man completely disintegrated. The illusion of our perfect partnership shattered into a million jagged pieces. I looked at Spencer not as my supportive fiancé, but as a cowardly parasite. He was a man perfectly willing to watch my family be publicly humiliated, as long as my corporate influence continued to bail out his crumbling inheritance. The heat of embarrassment that had flushed my cheeks just seconds ago instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a chilling, profound calmness that settled deep into my bones. I had spent 10 years navigating the ruthless, cutthroat world of corporate event management in Chicago. I had faced down aggressive executives, hostile vendors, and million-dollar crises without breaking a sweat. I was not about to be broken by a desperate aging snob in a rented tuxedo. I pulled my wrist out of Spencer's grasp. The sudden violent motion caught him off guard, and his hand slapped against the mahogany table, rattling the silver cutlery. He hissed my name, warning me to stop, but I completely ignored him. I picked up my heavy linen napkin from my lap. I slowly and deliberately wiped the corner of my mouth. I folded the napkin into a perfect square and placed it beside my plate with measured precision. Every single movement was calculated to project absolute, unwavering control. Then, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The loud scrape of the wooden chair legs against the polished marble floor echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. The quiet murmurs of the wealthy aunts and uncles instantly died away. All eyes locked onto me. Richard lowered his crystal champagne flute, the smug, victorious smile still plastered across his face. He clearly expected me to burst into hysterical tears, to offer a pathetic apology for my background, or to run out of the room in shame. Instead, I reached into my designer evening bag and pulled out my smartphone. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim, romantic lighting of the dining hall. I bypassed my personal applications and opened the secure corporate portal for my company. The facial recognition software scanned my face and unlocked my administrative dashboard. Spencer shifted in his seat, his face suddenly draining of color. He did not know exactly what I was doing, but he recognized the cold, dead look in my eyes. He reached out and tried to grab my arm again. "Caroline, what are you doing with your phone?" He whispered frantically, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Put that away, right now. You are embarrassing yourself. Sit down before you ruin everything." I stepped back out of his reach, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Richard. I navigated to the global vendor contracts section of my portal. I scrolled past dozens of high-level corporate accounts until I found the specific file I was looking for. Wellington Estates Annual Executive Summit. I tapped the screen opening the Master Authorization panel. The numbers stared back at me in bold black font. $730,000. The status was marked as approved and scheduled for wire transfer on Monday morning. Richard Westa said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, icy authority that commanded the immediate attention of every single person in the room. It was the voice of a senior corporate director about to terminate a very bad investment. Richard narrowed his eyes, gripping the edge of the table. His flush deepened from a triumphant pink to an angry crimson. "What do you think you are doing, Caroline?" he demanded, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am in the middle of a toast to our family. Have you absolutely no manners?" "You speak quite a bit about legacies and elevated bloodlines." I continued, my thumb hovering directly over the digital cancellation button on my screen. "You speak about street garbage and mediocrity, but you seem to suffer from a very severe case of financial amnesia. You seem to have completely forgotten exactly whose money is currently keeping the electricity on in this dining hall." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the guests. Several of the older women clutched their pearl necklaces in sheer horror. Spencer leaped to his feet, his chair tipping over backwards and crashing onto the floor. "Caroline, stop it!" Spencer yelled, throwing his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Please, whatever you are looking at on that screen, just close the app." "My dad is just drunk. He did not mean it. Let us just go outside and talk about this." I kept my eyes fixed on his father. "You think you are better than me, Richard?" I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. "You think my parents are beneath you because they work for a living. But the truth is, your historic estate is nothing but a decaying facade. You are drowning in debt, and you are relying on my corporate contract to save you from total bankruptcy." Richard's jaw dropped. The smug arrogance finally melted off his face, replaced by a creeping, cold dread. He tried to speak, but only a strangled, sputtering sound came out of his throat. "And since my street garbage money is clearly not good enough for your pristine bloodline," I announced, tapping the bright red button on my screen, "I have just officially canceled the corporate summit." The system prompt appeared on my screen, asking for final confirmation. "Are you sure you want to terminate this vendor agreement and recall all associated funds?" I tapped yes. The screen flashed green, indicating the contract was successfully terminated and the massive payment was permanently voided. I locked my phone and dropped it back into my purse with a soft final thud. "The $730,000 has been pulled from your escrow account," I told him, watching the absolute terror wash over his features. "It will reflect as a zero balance on your ledger by tomorrow morning. I suggest you call your bank as soon as they open. I hear their foreclosure department is incredibly unforgiving this time of year. Good luck paying your mortgage." Richard staggered backward, bumping hard into the table. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound echoed through the silent room, signaling the absolute destruction of his family empire. He clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the reality of his financial ruin crashed down upon him. I turned my back on him and looked at my parents. They were staring at me in absolute awe, their previous humiliation entirely erased by my swift execution of justice. "Mom, Dad, please get your coats," I said, my voice instantly softening into a tone of gentle respect. "We are leaving this dump." My father stood up, pulling his shoulders back and lifting his chin. He gently helped my mother out of her chair. They did not look at anyone else in the room. They simply followed my lead. I turned and began walking toward the grand double doors of the dining hall. The crowd of wealthy relatives and country club elites instinctively parted for me, their faces painted with utter shock and disbelief. No one dared to say a single word. They were no longer looking down on a naive farm girl. They were looking at the executioner of the Wellington legacy. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the lavish marble foyer. The cool night air filtered in through the front entrance, bringing a wave of immense relief. We walked out onto the grand stone portico where the valet stand was located. I handed the attendant my ticket and asked him to bring my car around immediately. "Caroline, wait." Spencer's desperate voice echoed from the foyer. I turned to see him sprinting through the heavy doors, his expensive suit jacket flapping wildly behind him. His face was a mask of pure panic, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with terror. He closed the distance between us and grabbed my shoulder, trying to spin me around to face him. "You cannot do this to us!" He yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are you out of your mind? You are destroying my family over a stupid, drunken toast. You are destroying our wedding." I stepped backward violently, shaking off his hand. "Do not ever touch me again," I warned him, my voice dangerously low. Spencer threw his hands up, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. The gaslighting began instantly, a desperate attempt to regain control of his financial lifeline. "You are overreacting, Caroline," he pleaded, stepping toward me again. "My dad is just an old man with outdated views. He had too much scotch. He did not mean a single word he said. You know how much I love you. You know how much we need that contract to start our life together. Please, you have to log back into your system and reinstate the funds. If you do not do it tonight, the bank will initiate the foreclosure protocol on Monday." I stared at him, letting his pathetic manipulative words hang in the crisp night air. He was not apologizing for my pain. He was not defending my parents. He was only begging for his money. "You do not love me, Spencer," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "You love my corporate access. You thought I was a desperate, gullible girl who would eagerly finance your bankrupt lifestyle just to have a fancy last name." "That is a lie," he insisted, his voice cracking. "I love you, Caroline. We are getting married in a month. You cannot just throw all of that away because your feelings got hurt. Think about our future. Think about the life we planned." My father stepped forward, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "You heard my daughter," he said to Spencer, his voice deep and rough. "Back away from her right now." Spencer glared at my father, his facade of polite charm completely slipping away. "This has nothing to do with you," he snapped, his true arrogant nature finally showing through. "Caroline, you have to fix this. My father is having a panic attack inside. You are going to kill him with this stunt. Log back into your phone right now and fix the contract." I looked at the man I had shared a home with for 2 years. I saw nothing but a spoiled, entitled coward who was entirely incapable of taking responsibility for his own failures. "There is no contract," I stated firmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "There is no wedding. There is absolutely no future for us. You and your father made a very critical error tonight. You assumed I was weak. You assumed I would trade my self-respect for a place at your miserable dinner table." My car pulled up to the portico, the tires crunching softly against the gravel driveway. The valet stepped out, holding the door open for me. "Caroline, please," Spencer begged, dropping to his knees on the cold stone pavement. He grabbed the hem of my silk dress, tears finally spilling down his face. "I will do anything. I will make him apologize to your parents. I will cut him out of our lives. Just please do not let the bank take the estate. It is all I have left." I looked down at him, kneeling in the dirt, the picture of absolute pathetic desperation. I would rather be street garbage than be legally tied to a family of bankrupt leeches, I told him, pulling my dress out of his grasp. "Do not ever contact me again." I turned away from him and helped my mother into the back seat of the car. My father got into the passenger side, giving Spencer one last look of utter disgust. I slid behind the steering wheel and closed the door, shutting out the sound of his frantic sobbing. I put the car in drive and pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The engine roared to life and we sped away from Wellington Estates, leaving Spencer kneeling alone in the gravel driveway under the harsh glare of the security lights. I drove in total silence for the first few miles, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a deep, profound sense of clarity. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw my parents holding hands in the back seat, their dignity completely restored. I had lost a fiancé tonight, but I had gained my absolute freedom. The wedding was canceled, the money was safe, and the toxic leeches had been completely cut out of my life. But I knew this was not the end of the story. Men like Spencer and Richard do not just accept defeat quietly. They would try to retaliate. They would try to find another way to get their hands on my money. I took a deep breath of the cool air circulating through the car. Let them try, I thought to myself. I had already taken their estate. I was more than ready to take everything else they had left. The drive from Wellington Estates back to the heart of downtown Chicago was a blur of glowing highway lights and heavy, suffocating silence. My parents sat quietly in the back seat of my car, their hands tightly clasped together. They did not ask me any questions. They did not demand any explanations about the canceled $730,000 contract or the spectacular implosion of my engagement. They simply radiated a steady, quiet support that anchored me as my entire world was violently rearranged. I dropped them off at their hotel near the Magnificent Mile, making sure they were checked into a comfortable suite. I hugged my mother tightly, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her lavender soap. I told them I would be absolutely fine, and that I just needed to go back to my apartment to gather my things. My father kissed my forehead and told me how incredibly proud he was of my strength. When I finally pulled into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise building where Spencer and I lived, the adrenaline that had fueled my dramatic exit began to completely fade. It left behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that made my limbs feel heavy and sluggish. I rode the private elevator up to our penthouse on the 40th floor. The brass doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling, immaculately decorated space I had called home for the past 2 years. The apartment was pitch black except for the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the glittering Chicago skyline. I did not turn on the main lights. I did not want to see the expensive modern art on the walls or the custom Italian leather furniture. Every single item in this place had been carefully selected by Spencer to project an image of effortless inherited wealth. But I was the one who had actually paid for it all. My corporate salary, my bonuses, my long, grueling hours of overtime had funded this glittering lifestyle, while he played the role of a successful entrepreneur whose phantom business ventures never seemed to turn an actual profit. I walked straight into the master bedroom and pulled my large, hard-shell suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I moved methodically, operating on pure, unadulterated muscle memory. I opened my dresser drawers and began transferring my clothes into the suitcase. I did not fold them with my usual meticulous care. I just tossed them in desperate to erase every trace of my physical existence from this toxic space. I grabbed my cosmetics, my important financial documents, and a small lockbox containing my grandmother's heirloom jewelry. I wanted to be completely gone before Spencer sobered up enough to realize he needed to come crawling back to the apartment to beg for his financial lifeline. After zipping up my suitcase, I pulled it by the handle out into the main living area. I needed a glass of cold water to soothe my dry throat before I walked out the door for good. I left my luggage by the front entrance and padded softly across the hardwood floor toward the open concept kitchen. The kitchen was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by the faint ambient glow of the city lights pouring in through the massive windows. I walked over to the sprawling Calcutta marble island to grab a glass from the overhead cabinet. That was when the kitchen suddenly lit up with a bright, sharp glow. A soft digital chime echoed through the silent apartment. It was a familiar, cheerful sound that completely shattered the heavy stillness of the room. I looked down at the marble island. Sitting there right next to a half-empty bottle of expensive, sparkling water was Spencer's silver iPad. He had carelessly left it behind earlier that afternoon when he rushed out to meet his father at the country club. Spencer was notoriously sloppy with his devices. He never logged out of his accounts, and he always left his cloud synchronization turned on across all his personal electronics. He possessed the careless arrogance of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. Another soft chime rang out. The large screen illuminated again, casting a pale blue light across the dark marble surface. I had never once snooped through his phone or his tablet in the 2 years we had been together. I had respected his privacy completely because I fundamentally believed that trust was the absolute cornerstone of a successful marriage. But tonight, that trust had been publicly slaughtered on the altar of his father's repulsive ego. I stepped closer to the kitchen island. My eyes fell upon the glowing lock screen of the tablet. A string of iMessage notifications was stacked neatly on the display. The sender's name was clearly visible at the top of the screen. Jessica. My heart completely stopped. The air in my lungs suddenly felt thick and suffocating. A freezing wave of nausea crashed over me, rooting my feet to the floor. Jessica was the sweet, bubbly 26-year-old wedding planner we had hired 6 months ago to organize our extravagant, upcoming nuptials. She had been highly recommended by one of Spencer's wealthy cousins. Jessica was always smiling, always incredibly accommodating, and always carrying a thick binder full of floral arrangements and tasting menus. Spencer had insisted on hiring her, claiming that my corporate event schedule was already far too stressful and that I needed a professional to take the burden of wedding planning off my shoulders. I had spent countless evenings sitting on the living room sofa with Jessica drinking wine and discussing the exact shade of ivory for the table linens. She had looked me in the eye, called me a brilliant girl boss, and told me how incredibly lucky Spencer was to have a woman like me. My hands began to tremble violently as I stared down at the screen. Why was the sweet, innocent wedding planner texting my fiancé at 2 o'clock in the morning? I reached out and touched the screen. Spencer had never bothered to set a complex passcode. It was simply his birth year. I typed in the 4 digits, and the screen instantly unlocked, revealing the open messaging application. What I saw on that bright digital display was a level of betrayal so profound and so monstrous that it completely defied human comprehension. This was not a simple affair. This was not a moment of weakness or a drunken mistake. The messages, stretching back for months, detailed an elaborate, meticulously coordinated financial conspiracy designed to drain me of every single asset I possessed. I stood in the dark kitchen, reading the most recent messages sent just moments ago. My eyes scanned the cruel, mocking words, searing them permanently into my memory. Did she sign the prenup yet? Jessica wrote, her digital tone dripping with greedy anticipation. I stared at that sentence, feeling a massive knot tighten in my stomach. The prenuptial agreement. Richard's aggressive legal team had been hounding me for weeks to sign a massive stack of complex documents, claiming it was just a standard formality to protect the historic integrity of Wellington Estates. I had planned to sign it on Monday morning. My eyes moved to the next line of text. The words hit me harder than a physical blow to the face. We need that $730,000 to save your dad's estate before the bank forecloses, Jessica continued. My breath caught in my throat. The room began to spin violently. The corporate summit contract. The massive deal I had fought my own board of directors to secure for Wellington Estates. It was never about earning his father's respect. It was never about proving my worth to his family. The entire wedding, the grand venue, the lavish engagement dinner, it was all a desperately constructed mirage to manipulate me into saving them from total financial ruin. They were bankrupt. They were drowning in debt, and I was nothing to them but a walking corporate ATM machine. But the final message, the one that completely shattered my soul and fundamentally altered the trajectory of my entire life, was sitting at the very bottom of the screen. Once the money clears, you can dump the farm girl, and we will raise our son in the estate, Jessica wrote. Directly below that horrifying sentence was an image file. It took a fraction of a second to load over the wireless network. It was a black and white ultrasound photo. The grainy image of a developing fetus was displayed with crystal clarity on the glowing screen. In the top right corner of the medical image printed in stark digital text was the patient name: Jessica Sutton, gestational age 14 weeks. I dropped the iPad. The heavy aluminum device clattered loudly against the solid marble countertop, the sound echoing sharply through the cavernous, empty apartment. I stumbled backward, hitting my spine against the stainless steel refrigerator. I clutched my stomach, bending forward, as a violent wave of physical sickness washed over me. I gasped for air, feeling like I was drowning in an ocean of lies. 14 weeks, 3.5 months, while I was working grueling 80-hour weeks to secure the corporate funding that would supposedly build our future, Spencer was sleeping with the woman hired to plan our wedding. While I was enduring his father's endless condescending remarks about my lack of pedigree, Spencer was laughing behind my back, plotting to steal my money and discard me the second the bank wire cleared. He was not just a spineless coward who was afraid to stand up to his traditional father. He was a ruthless, calculating predator. He was an active co-conspirator in a plot to completely destroy my life. Every single moment of our 2-year relationship flashed before my eyes, painted in a horrifying new light. Every sweet compliment was a manipulation. Every romantic date was a calculated investment strategy. He had specifically targeted me for my earning potential and my high-level corporate access. He knew I was a self-made woman with a deep-seated desire for a loving, supportive family, and he had weaponized my own vulnerabilities against me. They thought I was naive. They thought because I came from a modest farming background that I was a simple, trusting fool who would blindly sign away my hard-earned wealth for the privilege of marrying into their elite circle. They thought they could secure the $730,000 contract cash my corporate check and then kick the street garbage to the curb so they could play house in their rescued mansion. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing the heels of my hands against my throbbing temples. The pain of the romantic betrayal was agonizing, but it was rapidly being swallowed whole by a massive, towering inferno of pure, unadulterated rage. I slowly opened my eyes. The tears that had threatened to spill just moments ago were completely gone. The agonizing heartbreak was instantly cauterized by the burning heat of my fury. I stood up straight, pushing myself off the refrigerator. I walked back over to the kitchen island and picked up the iPad. My hands were no longer shaking. My vision was no longer blurry. I was operating with the cold, lethal precision of a corporate director executing a hostile takeover. I used my own phone to take high-resolution photographs of every single text message on the screen. I captured the timestamps, the contact information, and the ultrasound photo, ensuring that every piece of damning evidence was securely backed up to my personal encrypted cloud storage. I read Jessica's words one last time. Did she sign the prenup yet? A chilling realization dawned on me. The prenuptial agreement was not just a standard document to protect their historic assets. If the entire marriage was a financial trap to secure the corporate contract, then the legal documents they had practically forced into my hands were undoubtedly filled with hidden traps designed to ruin me. They were planning to steal my money and leave me with nothing. I turned off the iPad screen, plunging the kitchen back into total darkness. Spencer and Richard had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the intelligence and the ruthlessness of the woman they were trying to destroy. They thought they were the predators in this scenario. They thought they were the sharks circling a helpless, bleeding fish. They were wrong. I picked up my purse from the counter. I felt the heavy weight of the thick manila envelope containing the unsigned prenuptial agreement resting inside. I walked toward the front door where my suitcase was waiting. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a judge about to hand down a very severe sentence. I grabbed the handle of my luggage and walked out of the apartment, letting the heavy door lock behind me. I was going to rip their entire empire down to the foundation. The drive from Wellington Estates back to the heart of downtown Chicago was a blur of glowing highway lights and heavy, suffocating silence. My parents sat quietly in the back seat of my car, their hands tightly clasped together. They did not ask me any questions. They did not demand any explanations about the canceled $730,000 contract or the spectacular implosion of my engagement. They simply radiated a steady, quiet support that anchored me as my entire world was violently rearranged. I dropped them off at their hotel near the Magnificent Mile, making sure they were checked into a comfortable suite. I hugged my mother tightly, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her lavender soap. I told them I would be absolutely fine and that I just needed to go back to my apartment to gather my things. My father kissed my forehead and told me how incredibly proud he was of my strength. When I finally pulled into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise building where Spencer and I lived, the adrenaline that had fueled my dramatic exit began to completely fade. It left behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that made my limbs feel heavy and sluggish. I rode the private elevator up to our penthouse on the 40th floor. The brass doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling, immaculately decorated space I had called home for the past 2 years. The apartment was pitch black except for the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the glittering Chicago skyline. I did not turn on the main lights. I did not want to see the expensive modern art on the walls or the custom Italian leather furniture. Every single item in this place had been carefully selected by Spencer to project an image of effortless, inherited wealth. But I was the one who had actually paid for it all. My corporate salary, my bonuses, my long, grueling hours of overtime had funded this glittering lifestyle while he played the role of a successful entrepreneur whose phantom business ventures never seemed to turn an actual profit. I walked straight into the master bedroom and pulled my large hardshell suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I moved methodically, operating on pure, unadulterated muscle memory. I opened my dresser drawers and began transferring my clothes into the suitcase. I did not fold them with my usual meticulous care. I just tossed them in, desperate to erase every trace of my physical existence from this toxic space. I grabbed my cosmetics, my important financial documents, and a small lockbox containing my grandmother's heirloom jewelry. I wanted to be completely gone before Spencer sobered up enough to realize he needed to come crawling back to the apartment to beg for his financial lifeline. After zipping up my suitcase, I pulled it by the handle out into the main living area. I needed a glass of cold water to soothe my dry throat before I walked out the door for good. I left my luggage by the front entrance and padded softly across the hardwood floor toward the open concept kitchen. The kitchen was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by the faint ambient glow of the city lights pouring in through the massive windows. I walked over to the sprawling Calcutta marble island to grab a glass from the overhead cabinet. That was when the kitchen suddenly lit up with a bright, sharp glow. A soft digital chime echoed through the silent apartment. It was a familiar, cheerful sound that completely shattered the heavy stillness of the room. I looked down at the marble island. Sitting there right next to a half-empty bottle of expensive sparkling water was Spencer's silver iPad. He had carelessly left it behind earlier that afternoon when he rushed out to meet his father at the country club. Spencer was notoriously sloppy with his devices. He never logged out of his accounts, and he always left his cloud synchronization turned on across all his personal electronics. He possessed the careless arrogance of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. Another soft chime rang out. The large screen illuminated again, casting a pale blue light across the dark marble surface. I had never once snooped through his phone or his tablet in the 2 years we had been together. I had respected his privacy completely because I fundamentally believed that trust was the absolute cornerstone of a successful marriage. But tonight, that trust had been publicly slaughtered on the altar of his father's repulsive ego. I stepped closer to the kitchen island. My eyes fell upon the glowing lock screen of the tablet. A string of iMessage notifications was stacked neatly on the display. The sender's name was clearly visible at the top of the screen. Jessica. My heart completely stopped. The air in my lungs suddenly felt thick and suffocating. A freezing wave of nausea crashed over me, rooting my feet to the floor. Jessica was the sweet, bubbly, 26-year-old wedding planner we had hired 6 months ago to organize our extravagant, upcoming nuptials. She had been highly recommended by one of Spencer's wealthy cousins. Jessica was always smiling, always incredibly accommodating, and always carrying a thick binder full of floral arrangements and tasting menus. Spencer had insisted on hiring her, claiming that my corporate event schedule was already far too stressful, and that I needed a professional to take the burden of wedding planning off my shoulders. I had spent countless evenings sitting on the living room sofa with Jessica drinking wine and discussing the exact shade of ivory for the table linens. She had looked me in the eye, called me a brilliant girl boss, and told me how incredibly lucky Spencer was to have a woman like me. My hands began to tremble violently as I stared down at the screen. Why was the sweet, innocent wedding planner texting my fiancé at 2 o'clock in the morning? I reached out and touched the screen. Spencer had never bothered to set a complex passcode. It was simply his birth year. I typed in the 4 digits, and the screen instantly unlocked, revealing the open messaging application. What I saw on that bright digital display was a level of betrayal so profound and so monstrous that it completely defied human comprehension. This was not a simple affair. This was not a moment of weakness or a drunken mistake. The messages, stretching back for months, detailed an elaborate, meticulously coordinated financial conspiracy designed to drain me of every single asset I possessed. I stood in the dark kitchen, reading the most recent messages sent just moments ago. My eyes scanned the cruel, mocking words, searing them permanently into my memory. Did she sign the prenup yet? Jessica wrote her digital tone dripping with greedy anticipation. I stared at that sentence, feeling a massive knot tighten in my stomach. The prenuptial agreement. Richard's aggressive legal team had been hounding me for weeks to sign a massive stack of complex documents, claiming it was just a standard formality to protect the historic integrity of Wellington Estates. I had planned to sign it on Monday morning. My eyes moved to the next line of text. The words hit me harder than a physical blow to the face. We need that $730,000 to save your dad's estate before the bank forecloses, Jessica continued. My breath caught in my throat. The room began to spin violently. The corporate summit contract. The massive deal I had fought my own board of directors to secure for Wellington Estates. It was never about earning his father's respect. It was never about proving my worth to his family. The entire wedding, the grand venue, the lavish engagement dinner. It was all a desperately constructed mirage to manipulate me into saving them from total financial ruin. They were bankrupt. They were drowning in debt, and I was nothing to them but a walking corporate ATM machine. But the final message, the one that completely shattered my soul and fundamentally altered the trajectory of my entire life, was sitting at the very bottom of the screen. Once the money clears, you can dump the farm girl, and we will raise our son in the estate, Jessica wrote. Directly below that horrifying sentence was an image file. It took a fraction of a second to load over the wireless network. It was a black and white ultrasound photo. The grainy image of a developing fetus was displayed with crystal clarity on the glowing screen. In the top right corner of the medical image, printed in stark digital text, was the patient name, Jessica Sutton. Gestational age 14 weeks. I dropped the iPad. The heavy aluminum device clattered loudly against the solid marble countertop, the sound echoing sharply through the cavernous, empty apartment. I stumbled backward, hitting my spine against the stainless steel refrigerator. I clutched my stomach, bending forward, as a violent wave of physical sickness washed over me. I gasped for air, feeling like I was drowning in an ocean of lies. 14 weeks. 3.5 months, while I was working grueling 80-hour weeks to secure the corporate funding that would supposedly build our future, Spencer was sleeping with the woman hired to plan our wedding, while I was enduring his father's endless condescending remarks about my lack of pedigree. Spencer was laughing behind my back, plotting to steal my money and discard me the second the bank wire cleared. He was not just a spineless coward who was afraid to stand up to his traditional father. He was a ruthless, calculating predator. He was an active co-conspirator in a plot to completely destroy my life. Every single moment of our 2-year relationship flashed before my eyes, painted in a horrifying new light. Every sweet compliment was a manipulation. Every romantic date was a calculated investment strategy. He had specifically targeted me for my earning potential and my high-level corporate access. He knew I was a self-made woman with a deep-seated desire for a loving, supportive family, and he had weaponized my own vulnerabilities against me. They thought I was naive. They thought because I came from a modest farming background that I was a simple, trusting fool who would blindly sign away my hard-earned wealth for the privilege of marrying into their elite circle. They thought they could secure the $730,000 contract cash, my corporate check, and then kick the street garbage to the curb so they could play house in their rescued mansion. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing the heels of my hands against my throbbing temples. The pain of the romantic betrayal was agonizing, but it was rapidly being swallowed whole by a massive, towering inferno of pure, unadulterated rage. I slowly opened my eyes. The tears that had threatened to spill just moments ago were completely gone. The agonizing heartbreak was instantly cauterized by the burning heat of my fury. I stood up straight, pushing myself off the refrigerator. I walked back over to the kitchen island and picked up the iPad. My hands were no longer shaking. My vision was no longer blurry. I was operating with the cold, lethal precision of a corporate director executing a hostile takeover. I used my own phone to take high-resolution photographs of every single text message on the screen. I captured the timestamps, the contact information, and the ultrasound photo, ensuring that every piece of damning evidence was securely backed up to my personal encrypted cloud storage. I read Jessica's words one last time. Did she sign the prenup yet? A chilling realization dawned on me. The prenuptial agreement was not just a standard document to protect their historic assets. If the entire marriage was a financial trap to secure the corporate contract, then the legal documents they had practically forced into my hands were undoubtedly filled with hidden traps designed to ruin me. They were planning to steal my money and leave me with nothing. I turned off the iPad screen, plunging the kitchen back into total darkness. Spencer and Richard had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the intelligence and the ruthlessness of the woman they were trying to destroy. They thought they were the predators in this scenario. They thought they were the sharks circling a helpless, bleeding fish. They were wrong. I picked up my purse from the counter. I felt the heavy weight of the thick manila envelope containing the unsigned prenuptial agreement resting inside. I walked toward the front door, where my suitcase was waiting. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a judge about to hand down a very severe sentence. I grabbed the handle of my luggage and walked out of the apartment, letting the heavy door lock behind me. I was going to rip their entire empire down to the foundation. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline when I returned to the penthouse. I had spent the night in a quiet hotel room, meticulously planning my strategy with Thomas. I walked through the front door of the condo and found Spencer sitting on the living room floor. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive designer suit was completely wrinkled. His tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his eyes were bloodshot from crying and a lack of sleep. When he heard my footsteps, he scrambled to his feet. He closed the distance between us and immediately dropped to his knees right in front of me. He grabbed my hands, his palms sweaty and cold. "Caroline, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a loud, pathetic sob. "Please tell me you are back. Please tell me you are not leaving me. I cannot live without you." I looked down at the man kneeling on the hardwood floor. Just 12 hours ago, I would have felt a deep, agonizing pain in my chest. I would have dropped to my knees beside him and wiped his tears. But now, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart was a solid block of ice. I knew exactly what he was crying over. He was not crying for me. He was crying for his bank account. He was terrified that his pregnant mistress and his bankrupt father were about to lose their lavish lifestyle, but I knew I had to play my part perfectly. I forced a small, trembling smile onto my face. I softened my eyes and let a single tear roll down my cheek. "Spencer," I whispered, making my voice sound fragile and insecure. I was just so hurt. Your father made me feel so incredibly small. I felt like I was not good enough for your family. Spencer eagerly jumped on my fabricated vulnerability. He stood up and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight embrace. I forced my body to relax against him, swallowing the intense wave of nausea that rose in my throat as I smelled his cologne. He told me that his father was a foolish old man. He told me that I was the most brilliant and beautiful woman in the world. He promised that he would defend me from now on. He told me that we were a team, and that nothing would ever come between us. He was laying the manipulation on thick and heavy, relying on the naive farm girl persona he thought I possessed. Then he pulled back just slightly, looking into my eyes with a carefully constructed expression of desperate panic. "Caroline, what about the corporate contract?" He asked, his voice trembling with manufactured fear. "My father got a call from the bank this morning. They saw the funds were recalled. They are threatening to begin the foreclosure process by the end of the week. We are going to lose Wellington Estates. We are going to lose the venue for our wedding. Is there any way you can call your board of directors? Is there any way you can reverse the cancellation?" I looked at him, letting a long moment of silence stretch between us. I needed him to squirm. I needed him to feel the absolute desperation of a man dangling over the edge of a cliff. I finally nodded slowly, playing the role of the loyal, devoted fiancé. I told him that I had overreacted. I told him that my emotions had gotten the better of me and that I had made a terrible professional mistake. I promised him that I would do everything in my power to fix the contract and save his family home. The wave of pure relief that washed over his face was so genuine it almost made me laugh out loud. He kissed my forehead repeatedly, calling me his savior. He had absolutely no idea that he was kissing the very woman who was about to destroy his entire world. "But there is a problem, Spencer," I said, pulling away from his embrace and walking into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of cold water, maintaining my calm, professional demeanor. My corporate compliance department was immediately alerted when I canceled a $730,000 contract. They flagged the Wellington Estates account. If I am going to reinstate the funding, I need to provide them with a comprehensive financial stability report. I need to prove to my board of directors that your father is running a solvent and reliable vendor operation. Spencer followed me into the kitchen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What does that mean, Caroline?" he asked. "What do you need?" I turned to face him, leaning casually against the marble island. "I need full administrative access to your father's accounting software and the estate financial servers." I lied effortlessly. "I need to review your ledgers, your tax filings, and your accounts payable. I will compile a clean, sanitized report for my compliance team. It is the only way I can push the money back through the system before the bank seizes the property." I watched the hesitation flicker across his eyes. I knew they were hiding massive financial crimes. I knew their books were cooked. Giving a senior corporate director full access to their internal servers was the most dangerous thing they could possibly do. But I also knew that Spencer was incredibly arrogant and incredibly desperate. He truly believed I was entirely blinded by my love for him. He thought I was just a naive girl from Illinois who would rubber stamp their documents without asking any difficult questions. "Let me call my father," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. He walked out onto the balcony to make the call. I stood in the kitchen sipping my water and listening to the muffled sounds of his frantic argument. I could picture Richard pacing around his decaying country club, furious that he had to surrender his financial privacy to the woman he had called street garbage just the night before. But they had absolutely no other choice. They were backed into a corner of their own making. 10 minutes later, Spencer walked back inside. He looked defeated but hopeful. "My father agreed," he said, handing me a small slip of paper. "These are the master login credentials for the Wellington Estates private server. The accounting software is all in there. Please, Caroline, just do whatever you have to do to make the contract look clean. We are completely relying on you." I took the slip of paper from his hand. My fingers brushed against his, and I had to actively suppress a triumphant smile. I promised him I would handle everything. I told him to go to the office and act perfectly normal. I told him I would stay home and work on the financial report. He kissed my cheek one last time, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. The heavy lock clicked shut behind him. I was finally alone. I walked over to the kitchen island where his iPad had been sitting the night before. I pulled my high-powered corporate laptop from my work bag and set it down on the dining table. The infiltration was complete. They had just handed me the keys to their own execution. The sun slowly set over the city, turning the sky a deep shade of purple and orange. I did not turn on the main lights in the apartment. I sat in the dark dining room, bathed entirely in the cool blue glow of my computer monitor. My fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid, practiced precision. I logged into the Wellington Estates server using the master credentials Spencer had given me. The system was outdated and incredibly poorly secured. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass their internal firewalls and gain root access to their entire financial history. I am a professional corporate event director, but I spent the first 5 years of my career working in forensic budget analysis. I know exactly how to read a balance sheet, and I know exactly how to spot a lie. I opened their main accounting ledger and began to dig through the numbers. What I found was a sprawling, chaotic mess of gross negligence and deliberate criminal fraud. Richard had been bleeding the historic estate dry for over a decade. The revenues from weddings and country club memberships were plummeting, but his personal withdrawals were skyrocketing. He was using the business accounts to fund luxury vacations, expensive country club dues, and high-stakes gambling debts. But the sheer incompetence of his spending was not the darkest secret hidden in these files. I pulled up the accounts payable registry and filtered the transactions for the last 12 months. I cross-referenced the vendor payments with the bank routing numbers. My eyes scanned the glowing screen, tracking a massive repetitive outflow of cash. Every single month for the past year, a payment of $15,000 was wired from the Wellington Estates Operational Fund to a vendor listed simply as Floral Designs Incorporated. I opened a new tab on my browser and ran a quick search on the Illinois State Business Registry. I typed in the corporate identification number for Floral Designs Incorporated. The results loaded instantly. The registered agent for the business was Jessica Sutton. The primary business address was listed as a luxury high-rise apartment building in downtown Chicago. A cold, bitter laugh escaped my lips. The sweet, bubbly 26-year-old wedding planner was not just sleeping with my fiancé. She was actively embezzling money from his family business. But as I dug deeper into the transaction history, I realized it was much worse than simple embezzlement. Spencer was the one authorizing the payments. He was using his father's failing estate to funnel a massive untaxed income directly to his pregnant mistress. They were laundering the money through a fake floral company to pay for her luxury apartment and her designer lifestyle. I kept digging, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thrill of absolute power. I found the tax records. Richard had not paid federal payroll taxes for his estate employees in over 3 years. He was falsifying his revenue reports to the Internal Revenue Service, hiding his income in offshore accounts, while simultaneously begging the local bank for extensions on his mortgage. The entire Wellington family empire was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. I remembered the prenuptial agreement they had tried to force me to sign. I pulled the thick manila envelope out of my bag and opened it under the light of my desk lamp. I flipped through the dense legal jargon, reading the fine print with the trained eye of a corporate shark. There it was, buried deep on page 42, a liability transfer clause. It stated that upon the legal solemnization of our marriage, I would become a joint guarantor for all outstanding debts and tax liabilities associated with Wellington Estates. They were not just trying to use my corporate contract to save their property. They were planning to legally shackle me to their federal tax fraud. If I had married Spencer, the Internal Revenue Service would have come after my personal wealth, my corporate stock options, and my entire life savings to pay off Richard's criminal debts. Spencer and Jessica would have taken the $730,000 and run, leaving me to face federal prosecution and total bankruptcy. The sheer monstrous cruelty of their plan took my breath away. They had looked me in the eye, eaten dinner with my hardworking parents, and actively plotted to destroy my entire existence. I felt a wave of adrenaline rush through my veins. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt like a natural disaster gathering strength off the coast, preparing to make a landfall. I opened an encrypted folder on my laptop. I began downloading everything. I saved the fraudulent invoices from Jessica's fake floral company. I saved the falsified tax returns. I saved the internal emails between Spencer and Richard, explicitly discussing their plans to hide assets from the government. I took screenshots of the bank routing numbers and the offshore accounts. I gathered thousands of pages of undeniable concrete evidence of federal crimes. I picked up my phone and called Thomas. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. "Thomas, I have it all." I said, my voice completely steady. "I am looking at years of tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. They are millions of dollars in debt, and they were planning to legally transfer their liabilities onto me through the prenuptial agreement." I heard Thomas exhale heavily on the other end of the line. "Caroline, this is federal prison-level territory," he warned. "If you walk away right now, you are safe. We can just block their numbers, and you never have to see them again." I looked at the glowing screen of my monitor, staring at the fake floral invoices paying for a mistress luxury apartment. I remembered the smug, arrogant look on Richard's face as he called my family street garbage. I remembered Spencer begging on his knees, perfectly willing to sacrifice me for his own greed. "I am not walking away, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. "If I walk away, they will just find another victim. They will find another successful woman to manipulate and drain. I want you to prepare the legal framework. We are not just going to expose them. We are going to buy their debt and take their entire estate. I want to leave them with absolutely nothing." "Understood, Caroline," Thomas replied, his professional tone returning. "Send me the files. I will begin drafting the proxy documents immediately. We will lock them down completely." I hung up the phone and initiated the massive file transfer. The progress bar on my screen slowly filled up, green moving bite by bite. I sat in the dark apartment, watching the evidence of their destruction securely upload to my lawyer's server. I had played the naive, forgiving fool perfectly. They had completely dropped their guard and handed me the weapon I needed to destroy them. The trap was now fully set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk right into it. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the dining room table. I sat perfectly still, staring at the screen of my laptop. My eyes burned from a severe lack of sleep, but my mind had never been clearer. I had spent the entire night downloading, analyzing, and cataloging every single financial crime Richard and Spencer had committed over the past decade. The sheer volume of their arrogance was staggering. They had treated the estate like a personal piggy bank, draining its resources to fund their lavish lifestyle while ignoring basic tax laws and vendor obligations. I closed the final spreadsheet and leaned back in my chair. The heavy, suffocating weight of their betrayal had completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I was no longer a heartbroken fiancé. I was a corporate executioner holding the absolute power to dismantle their entire existence. I picked up my phone and called Thomas. He answered immediately, his voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. I told him I had secured the evidence. I detailed the fake floral company, the offshore accounts, and the millions of dollars in unpaid federal taxes. Thomas listened in silence, absorbing the magnitude of the fraud. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Caroline," he said, his tone laced with deep respect, "you have enough evidence to put both of them in federal prison for a very long time, but we need to move carefully. If they realize you have this data, they will panic and attempt to destroy the physical servers." I told Thomas they would not suspect a thing. Spencer was entirely convinced that I was a naive, easily manipulated farm girl who was busy preparing a clean financial report to save his family. He thought he had me perfectly controlled, but I told Thomas I did not just want to expose their crimes to the authorities. I wanted absolute, total control over their punishment. I wanted to tear down the very foundation of their pretentious legacy. I told him I wanted to buy Wellington Estates. Thomas paused. He reminded me that the property was heavily mortgaged and currently in default. The local bank was already preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings because Richard had missed his last 4 payments. That is exactly why we are going to buy the debt. I explained, my voice cold and unwavering. I want you to set up a blind proxy limited liability company. Use my personal wealth, liquidate my stock options, empty my high-yield savings accounts, and tap into my private investment portfolios. I want enough liquid cash to purchase the distressed debt directly from their bank. I want to become their sole creditor. Thomas did not hesitate. He understood exactly what I was doing. He promised to have the proxy corporation established within the hour and told me to get dressed. It was time to pay a visit to the bank. Before leaving the penthouse, I stared at the walls of the luxury condo that I had funded. Every single piece of furniture, every expensive piece of art was purchased with the money I had earned through grueling corporate battles. Spencer had never contributed a single dime to our household expenses. He had always claimed his funds were tied up in complex estate investments. It was a massive lie. His money was tied up in a fake floral company designed to fund the lifestyle of his pregnant mistress. I packed my laptop into my leather bag, feeling the cold, heavy truth settle into my bones. The sheer magnitude of their deception required a response of equal devastation. I was not going to just walk away and let them find another victim. I was going to make sure they never had the financial capability to manipulate another human being for the rest of their pathetic lives. I took a long hot shower, washing away the lingering scent of Spencer's expensive cologne. I dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue power suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight bun and applied minimal makeup. I did not want to look like a future bride. I wanted to look like a predator. I drove my car out to the wealthy suburban town where Wellington Estates was located. The local bank sat on the corner of the pristine Main Street, housed in a historic brick building that practically reeked of old money and generational privilege. I parked my car and walked through the heavy glass doors, my high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The bank lobby was quiet and intensely intimidating, designed to make ordinary working-class people feel small and insignificant. But I did not feel small. I walked directly to the reception desk and asked to speak with the senior branch manager regarding a distressed commercial asset. The receptionist looked at me with a mixture of surprise and mild disdain, but my unwavering stare quickly forced her to pick up her phone. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a plush leather chair inside the sprawling office of Mr. Harrison, the senior branch manager. He was a balding man in his late 50s, wearing a tight gray suit and a condescending smile. He looked at me across his massive oak desk, clearly dismissing me as someone who did not belong in his world. "How can I help you, young lady?" he asked, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. I did not smile. I placed a sleek black folder on his desk and looked him directly in the eye. "I am representing a private investment group." I stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "We are interested in purchasing the defaulted commercial mortgage currently held by your institution for the property known as Wellington Estates." Mr. Harrison lost his condescending smile instantly. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting to the black folder and then back to my face. "I'm not sure how you acquired that information," he stammered, clearing his throat. "But the financial status of our clients is strictly confidential. We do not simply sell off our portfolios to random inquiries." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the edge of his desk. "Please do not insult my intelligence." "Mr. Harrison?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know exactly how much trouble that loan is causing your branch. Richard is millions of dollars in debt. He has not made a single mortgage payment in 4 months. Your risk assessment department is breathing down your neck to write off the bad debt and initiate a messy public foreclosure. But you are hesitating because a public foreclosure on a historic landmark will severely damage the reputation of your suburban branch. You are holding a toxic asset, and you are desperate for a quiet exit strategy." Mr. Harrison wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He knew I was absolutely right. The Wellington Estates mortgage was a massive bleeding wound on his quarterly balance sheet. He tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and puffing out his chest. "Even if we were willing to entertain a sale of the debt," he said defensively, "it would require an immense amount of liquid capital. The outstanding principal alone is staggering. We are not interested in negotiating with an unverified third party." I opened the black folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a certified proof of funds document generated by Thomas just an hour earlier. It displayed the massive cash reserves sitting in my newly formed proxy corporation. Mr. Harrison picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the 9-figure balance. The blood completely drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying mythical creature. My investment group is offering to purchase the Wellington Estates debt portfolio in its entirety right now in cash, I declared, watching the sheer panic and relief war across his features. We will pay you 80 cents on the dollar to take this toxic asset off your hands today. You get to clear your bad debt without a messy public scandal, and my group assumes total control of the mortgage. This is a one-time offer, Mr. Harrison. If I walk out of that door, you will be forced to explain to your regional director why you let a multi-million-dollar bailout slip through your fingers. The silence in the room was absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he calculated the immediate benefits of my offer. He was a greedy, desperate man, and I was handing him a golden parachute. He picked up his desk phone and called his legal department. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that office negotiating the complex terms of the debt transfer. Thomas handled the legal technicalities over the phone, ensuring that my identity remained completely hidden behind the impenetrable wall of the limited liability company. Mr. Harrison and his team of lawyers drew up the paperwork, their hands shaking as they processed the massive cash wire transfer. As the lawyers reviewed the final drafts of the transfer, I took a moment to reflect on my parents. I thought about my father working in the freezing Illinois winters to ensure I had enough money to buy textbooks. I thought about my mother wearing the same winter coat for 10 years so she could afford my college tuition. Richard had called them street garbage. He had looked at their calloused hands and decided they were unworthy of his presence. He had completely failed to realize that those calloused hands had raised a daughter who now possessed the financial weaponry to annihilate his entire bloodline. When Mr. Harrison handed me the final thick stack of transfer documents, his hands were visibly trembling. He offered me a weak, highly uncomfortable smile. "You drive a remarkably hard bargain," he murmured, wiping another layer of sweat from his brow. "I hope your investment group knows what they are doing with this property." I took the heavy fountain pen and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. "My investment group knows exactly what we are doing." "Mr. Harrison," I replied, standing up and sliding the documents into my briefcase. "We specialize in aggressive restructuring. We are going to clean house." I walked out of his office and back through the sprawling bank lobby. The receptionist who had sneered at me earlier now kept her eyes firmly glued to her computer monitor. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to Thomas. "The asset is secured. We own Wellington Estates." Thomas replied instantly. "Acknowledged. We will hold the foreclosure trigger until your signal." I slid the phone back into my pocket. I walked to my car with the master mortgage file secured safely inside my briefcase. The bright afternoon sun washed over my face, but I felt as cold and calculating as a machine. I was no longer just the farm girl that Richard had publicly humiliated. I was no longer the naive fiancé that Spencer was actively manipulating. I was secretly their absolute master. I was their single largest creditor. I now held the legal right to demand the immediate repayment of their massive debt. If they failed to pay, I held the power to seize their historic estate, evict them from their ancestral home, and liquidate every single asset they possessed. I had the power to crush them with a single phone call to my lawyer. But I was not going to make that call today. I was not going to give them the mercy of a quick private destruction. They had chosen to humiliate my hardworking parents in front of hundreds of people. They had chosen to use me as a financial shield while laughing behind my back. They wanted a grand high society wedding. They wanted to show off their elevated bloodline to the entire world. I decided I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would let them continue their pathetic charade. I would let Spencer continue to pretend he loved me. I would let Jessica continue to plan the extravagant reception. I would let Richard continue to boast about his historic legacy. I would wait patiently while they dug their own graves deeper and deeper. I would wait for the wedding day. I would wait until they were standing at the altar, surrounded by all their wealthy, snobbish friends and family. I would wait until they felt the most arrogant and triumphant before I delivered the fatal blow. I smiled, a sharp, terrifying smile as I unlocked my car. The trap was perfectly set, and they were about to walk right into a financial slaughterhouse. The afternoon sun poured through the massive arched windows of the Wellington Country Club, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. It was exactly 1 week before the wedding. The bridal shower was being hosted by Richard's incredibly snobby older sister, Aunt Beatrice. The room was decorated with an absurd amount of white orchids and crystal vases, all paid for by my corporate salary, of course. Dozens of wealthy older women sat around round tables covered in pristine white linen, sipping imported champagne and picking at miniature cucumber sandwiches. They wore heavy pearl necklaces and pastel-colored tweed suits, looking at me with thinly veiled contempt. I sat at the head of the main table wearing a stunning custom-tailored white silk designer dress that hugged my curves perfectly. I projected the exact image of a glowing, blissful bride-to-be. But beneath the surface of my polite smiles and polite nods, my blood ran completely cold. I was no longer the desperate farm girl seeking their approval. I was the secret owner of their entire existence. I sat in that lavish room, listening to their idle gossip, knowing that with a single phone call to my lawyer, Thomas, I could have every single one of them permanently evicted from their ancestral homes. Aunt Beatrice leaned across the table, her diamond earrings catching the light. She looked me up and down with a highly critical eye. She asked me in a sickly sweet voice if my parents were able to find suitable attire for the ceremony next week. She implied that perhaps they could recommend a decent tailor, so my family would not embarrass them in front of the high society guests. A week ago, a comment like that would have made my cheeks flush with hot, burning shame. I would have lowered my eyes and offered a quiet apology. But today, I just smiled at her. I offered a perfectly polite and incredibly hollow smile. I told her that my parents were perfectly capable of dressing themselves and that I was far more concerned about making sure the estate did not literally crumble during the reception. The subtle jab went completely over her head. She just scoffed and took another sip of her champagne, completely unaware that the very chair she was sitting on was essentially my property. The heavy double doors of the banquet room swung open and Jessica walked in. She was carrying a massive clipboard and wearing a headset, acting the part of the incredibly diligent and hardworking wedding planner. She wore a tight black dress that subtly highlighted the tiny growing bump of her 14-week pregnancy. She had a wide, cheerful smile plastered across her face as she greeted the various aunts and cousins. She acted so incredibly familiar with Spencer's family. She hugged Aunt Beatrice and kissed her on the cheek. She laughed at a joke made by one of the wealthy cousins. She was asserting her dominance in the room, marking her territory right in front of my face. She thought she was the cleverest person in the entire world. She thought she had successfully manipulated a blind, foolish executive into financing her entire life. I watched her glide across the room, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calmness. I knew exactly what she was. I had spent hours staring at the forensic financial evidence, downloading the fake invoices she submitted through her fraudulent floral company. I knew the exact dollar amount she was stealing from me every single month. I watched her touch her stomach lightly, a gesture that was entirely calculated to remind herself of the anchor she had secured with Spencer. She thought that baby was her golden ticket to a life of effortless luxury. She had absolutely no idea that the money she was banking on had already been completely seized. She had no idea that she was carrying a child for a man who was now millions of dollars in debt to his own fiancé. Jessica slowly made her way toward the head table where I was sitting. She picked up a tray from a passing waiter. The tray held a single tall glass of dark red burgundy wine. She held the tray with both hands, her eyes locked directly onto my pristine white silk dress. I saw the dark, malicious intent flashing in her eyes. I knew exactly what she was going to do. I had spent a decade navigating the ruthless and cutthroat world of corporate business. I had dealt with hostile executives and aggressive competitors who would stab you in the back for a minor promotion. Jessica's petty high school mean girl tactics were so incredibly transparent it was almost insulting. She walked toward me, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. As she approached my chair, she suddenly feigned a massive stumble. She let out a loud theatrical gasp and threw her hands forward. The tray tipped violently. The tall crystal glass shattered against the edge of the table, and a massive wave of dark red wine splashed directly onto the bodice of my expensive white silk dress. The dark liquid quickly soaked into the delicate fabric, spreading like a massive bleeding wound across my chest and down into my lap. The entire room gasped in absolute horror. The soft murmurs of the wealthy aunts and cousins instantly died away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Aunt Beatrice covered her mouth with her hands. Several women stood up from their chairs, their eyes wide with shock. It was a picture-perfect disaster carefully orchestrated to humiliate the bride in front of the entire family just days before the wedding. Jessica immediately dropped to her knees. She grabbed a white cloth napkin from the table and began dabbing frantically at my ruined dress. "Oh my God, Caroline," she cried out, her voice incredibly loud and vibrating with fake panic. "I am so incredibly sorry. I just completely lost my footing. My heels caught on the edge of the rug. I am so clumsy. Please forgive me. I will pay for the dry cleaning, I promise." She kept dabbing at my legs, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance for the rest of the room. She wanted them to see her as the poor, overworked wedding planner who made a simple, clumsy mistake. But as she leaned in closer, her face hovered just inches from my ear. The loud fake sobbing instantly stopped. Her entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The mask of sweet innocence dropped, completely revealing the cold, greedy monster hiding underneath. She pressed her lips close to my ear, and her voice dropped to a venomous, icy whisper that only I could hear. "Enjoy the dress while it lasts," she hissed, the cruel words slicing through the air like a sharpened blade. "You are just a walking ATM for my future husband." She pulled back slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. She expected to see tears. She expected to see my face crumple in absolute devastating heartbreak. She expected me to jump up from the table, scream at her, and run out of the room, crying like a hysterical child. She wanted me to make a massive scene so that Spencer and his family could call me crazy and unstable. She wanted to prove to everyone in the room that the farm girl was entirely unfit to join their elevated bloodline. But I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still in my chair, the dark red wine dripping slowly onto the polished floor. My face remained an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. The devastation and the heartbreak she so desperately wanted to see had been entirely burned out of me the night I found her ultrasound photo on Spencer's iPad. I felt nothing but a deep, profound sense of towering authority. I was the executioner, and she was just a clueless prisoner taunting me from inside her cell. What Jessica did not know, what she could not possibly fathom with her shallow, greedy mind, was that my expensive designer purse was sitting on the table directly next to my chair. And hidden deep inside the side pocket of that purse, perfectly camouflaged and completely undetectable, was a highly sensitive digital audio recorder. I had turned it on the moment I stepped out of my car this morning. It had been recording every single conversation, every single fake compliment, and every single malicious whisper for the past 3 hours. The digital recorder captured the loud crash of the glass. It captured the fake gasps of the aunts. It captured Jessica's loud theatrical apology. And most importantly, its high-definition microphone perfectly captured her venomous whisper, calling me a walking ATM for her future husband. I had the physical evidence of their fraud on my servers. Now I had the undeniable audio evidence of her malicious intent recorded in crystal-clear digital sound. My trap was growing tighter and more inescapable by the second. I looked down at Jessica, who was still kneeling on the floor holding the stained napkin. The smug, victorious glint in her eyes began to falter as she realized I was not reacting the way she had planned. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a predator analyzing its prey. I slowly reached out and took the napkin from her trembling hand. I gracefully and deliberately dabbed at a small spot of wine on my wrist. Every single movement was calculated to project immense, unwavering power. I placed the napkin gently on the table and looked her directly in the eyes. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who held the absolute power to ruin lives. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to hers. My voice was calm, pleasant, and incredibly polite, carrying just enough volume for the women at the nearby tables to hear me. "Accidents happen, Jessica," I said, my voice smooth and totally devoid of anger. "Please do not worry about the dress. It is just material. I am far more focused on the future." I paused, letting my eyes drop down to her stomach for a fraction of a second before looking back up into her eyes. I watched the sudden flash of pure terror ripple across her face. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her hands instinctively flew to her waist. "Enjoy the wedding planning, Jessica." I continued, my smile widening just a fraction. "Make sure everything is picture perfect. I have a feeling this wedding is going to be an event that absolutely no one will ever forget." I pushed my chair back and stood up. The heavy silk of my ruined dress rustled softly in the quiet room. I picked up my designer purse, ensuring my hand brushed against the pocket, holding the digital recorder. I looked out at the room of silent, staring women. Aunt Beatrice was gripping her pearl necklace, her mouth hanging slightly open. "Ladies, please excuse me," I announced, projecting my voice with crisp professional authority. "I need to go freshen up. Please continue to enjoy the champagne." I turned my back on Jessica, leaving her kneeling on the floor in a puddle of spilled wine. She looked incredibly small and suddenly very afraid. I walked toward the heavy double doors, my head held high, my shoulders pulled back. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who completely owned the room. As I stepped out into the quiet marble hallway, the heavy doors closed behind me, shutting out the oppressive fake atmosphere of the bridal shower. I walked toward the luxury restrooms, the sound of my heels echoing off the high ceilings. I reached into my purse and clicked the stop button on the hidden digital recorder. I saved the audio file, encrypting it instantly, and backing it up to the secure cloud server Thomas had established for me. I stood in front of the massive gold-rimmed mirror in the restroom, looking at the dark red stain ruining my beautiful white dress. It looked like blood. It looked like the brutal, violent death of the naive, innocent girl I used to be. I turned on the gold faucet and let the cold water run over my fingers. I was not angry about the dress. The dress was a minor casualty in a massive war. I was fighting for my dignity, my financial freedom, and the total destruction of the parasites who had tried to consume me. I knew Spencer would be waiting for me back at the penthouse. He would have received a frantic text message from Jessica by now. He would be preparing another round of pathetic manipulation, ready to gaslight me into believing that Jessica was just a clumsy employee and that I was overreacting to a simple spill. He would try to coddle me and soothe me, desperate to ensure that the corporate contract was still moving forward. Let him try, I thought to myself, grabbing a thick paper towel to dry my hands. Let him spin his web of lies. Let him play the loving, supportive fiancé. Let Jessica continue to organize the floral arrangements and the catering menus. Let Richard continue to brag to his wealthy friends about the massive corporate bailout that was going to save his failing country club. They were all dancing on a stage that I had built. They were reading lines from a script that I had secretly rewritten. They thought the wedding day was going to be the grand finale of their brilliant financial heist. They thought they were going to walk away with $730,000 and leave me broken and humiliated. They had absolutely no idea that the wedding day was actually going to be their execution. I was going to let them put on their rented tuxedos and their expensive dresses. I was going to let them gather all their snobby relatives and their country club friends into one massive, beautifully decorated room. And then, I was going to drop a bomb that would obliterate their entire family legacy permanently. I looked at my reflection one last time, adjusting a stray strand of hair. My eyes were cold sharp and totally dead. The walking ATM was about to permanently close their accounts. I turned and walked out of the restroom, ready to go back out there and play my role to absolute perfection. The countdown to their destruction had officially begun. The heavy, dark clouds over downtown Chicago matched the icy calm, settling over my soul. I sat in the dim light of my home office, waiting for the inevitable. The digital clock on my monitor read 8:30 in the morning. Exactly 48 hours until the wedding. Exactly 48 hours until Richard and Spencer planned to execute their final betrayal. My proxy corporation now completely controlled their defaulted mortgage, and I had successfully triggered a federal fraud alert that locked down every single liquid asset Wellington Estates possessed. They were completely paralyzed, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. The heavy oak front door of the penthouse suddenly slammed open. The violent sound echoed through the sprawling apartment, followed by the frantic slapping of leather dress shoes against the hardwood floor. Caroline, where are you?" Spencer's voice was incredibly high-pitched and cracking with absolute terror. I slowly closed my laptop, ensuring the massive files of their tax evasion and offshore transfers were safely encrypted. I took a deep, steadying breath and completely erased the cold, predatory look from my face. I replaced it with the soft, wide-eyed expression of a naive and deeply concerned fiancé. I stepped out of the office and walked toward the main living area. Spencer was pacing near the kitchen island, completely unhinged. His expensive designer suit was a wrinkled disaster. His silk tie was pulled loose, and his usually perfectly styled hair was sticking up in sweaty clumps. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble into dust. When he saw me, he rushed forward and grabbed my shoulders, his grip painfully tight. "Caroline, you have to help me," he gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The bank froze everything. "The accounts are completely locked. My father is having a massive panic attack at the estate. The vendors are calling nonstop, demanding the final payments, and we do not have a single dollar of liquid cash to give them." I widened my eyes, placing a gentle, comforting hand over his racing heart. "Oh my God, Spencer," I said, forcing my voice to tremble with perfectly manufactured sympathy. "What happened? I thought you said it was just a simple routine payment issue yesterday." He completely fell for my act. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically. "It is a nightmare." He choked out the lie, easily spilling past his lips. "The bank compliance office flagged one of our international vendor payments as suspicious. They locked the entire corporate profile. The bank manager is ignoring our calls. If we cannot get the catering and floral teams paid by noon today, they are going to walk out. The wedding will be a total disaster. Everyone in Chicago high society will know we are broke." I looked at him, studying the sheer pathetic desperation leaking from his pores. He was begging his primary victim to finance the very event designed to destroy her. I knew exactly why that international payment was flagged. It was a $150,000 wire transfer directed to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, registered entirely to his pregnant mistress. He was trying to hide his remaining cash from the Internal Revenue Service before the bank foreclosed on his family home. "Caroline, please," he begged, dropping entirely to his knees on the cold hardwood floor. He wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my stomach. "You are a senior corporate director. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings. Please just write a personal check to cover the wedding vendors. Just until the bank fixes this stupid glitch on Monday, I promise I will pay you back every single cent." I looked down at the man who had plotted to steal my money and leave me legally responsible for his massive federal tax fraud. My heart did not break. It felt absolutely nothing but a cold, towering sense of authority. But I knew I had to maintain the facade to keep them completely trapped until the ceremony. I gently stroked his hair, pulling him back to his feet. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken partner. "Spencer, I am so incredibly sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. "I want to help you more than anything in the world, but I cannot access my money." Spencer froze, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock. "What do you mean you cannot access your money?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, panicked whisper. I looked him directly in the eye, delivering the lie with flawless precision. "Because I forced my corporate board to reinstate the $730,000 contract for your father. They demanded a massive security guarantee," I explained. "They required me to place all of my personal liquid assets into a secure corporate escrow account as collateral. My hands are completely tied, Spencer. I cannot withdraw a single dollar until the summit is officially completed next month. If I try to break the escrow seal now, the board will immediately cancel the Wellington Estates contract for good." I watched the realization wash over him. It was a perfectly constructed trap. Because he so desperately wanted that massive corporate payout on Monday, he could not push me to access my funds. He was entirely paralyzed by his own greed. He believed that if he pressured me, the corporate deal would fall apart and they would lose the estate permanently. He staggered backward, running his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots. "We are ruined," he muttered, staring blankly at the floor. "The caterers are going to pack up the trucks. The floral team is going to dump the orchids. My father is going to be humiliated in front of the entire country club." I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him, resting my chin on his shoulder. I stared out the panoramic windows at the beautiful Chicago skyline, a cold, victorious smile spreading across my face. "Everything is going to be okay, Spencer," I murmured soothingly. "Your father is a powerful man with a historic legacy. Just explain the banking glitch to the vendors. They will surely extend you a tiny line of credit for 48 hours. You just need to hold on until the wedding." He pulled away from me, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "I have to get back to the estate," he said, his voice hollow and defeated. "I have to try to calm my father down and beg the caterers to stay." He did not kiss me goodbye. He just turned and sprinted out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him. I walked over to the wet bar and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water, taking a slow, refreshing sip. They were currently trapped inside a burning building, and I had securely locked all the emergency exits. They were going to spend the next 2 days sweating, bleeding, and groveling to keep their fragile facade of wealth from collapsing. And they still genuinely believed that I was going to save them on Monday morning. I walked back into my home office and sat down at my desk. The infiltration was complete. I had downloaded every single piece of evidence proving their massive tax evasion and fraudulent offshore accounts. But I was not just going to hand this information over to the federal authorities. I was going to use it to completely dismantle their social standing. I opened a secure encrypted email server. I began drafting a highly detailed anonymous message. I attached the scanned copies of the fake floral invoices Jessica had been submitting for the past year. I attached the offshore wire transfer receipts proving Spencer was funneling money to the Cayman Islands. And finally, I attached the undeniable audio recording I had captured at the bridal shower the day before. The crystal clear file of Jessica whispering that I was just a walking ATM for her future husband. I set the email on a delayed timer. It was scheduled to automatically send to every single guest on the wedding RSVP list, including all the wealthy country club elites, the snobby aunts, and the high society cousins. The email would deploy exactly 5 minutes after the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. But I was not finished. The social humiliation was only the first part of the execution. I needed to ensure their financial ruin was absolute and inescapable. I picked up my phone and called Thomas. He answered immediately. "Caroline, the asset is completely secured," he confirmed. "Your proxy corporation is now the sole holder of the Wellington Estates defaulted commercial mortgage. You are legally their primary creditor. We can file the foreclosure notice at your command." "Excellent," I replied, my voice cold and sharp. "Draft the final foreclosure and immediate eviction notices. Have the federal marshals on standby, but hold the execution until I give you the final signal." Thomas paused for a moment, a hint of professional awe in his voice. "You are really going to drop the hammer during the actual ceremony, are you not?" I smiled a chilling smile that never reached my eyes. "I am going to let them stand at the altar, Thomas. I am going to let them look out at their 200 wealthy guests and feel the absolute peak of arrogant victory. and then I am going to rip the entire floor out from underneath their feet. They wanted a grand performance to remember. I am going to give them a finale they will never forget. I ended the call and closed my laptop, dropping it securely into my designer tote bag. I walked into the master bedroom and looked at the stunning custom-tailored wedding gown hanging on the back of the closet door. It was pristine, flawless, and incredibly expensive. I reached out and gently touched the delicate silk fabric. I was not going to be a victim. I was not going to be the pathetic farm girl who ran away crying when she discovered her fiancé was a cheating predator. I was a senior corporate director who had successfully navigated hostile takeovers and aggressive boardroom battles. I knew exactly how to calculate risk, and I knew exactly how to execute a flawless destruction. Spencer and Richard thought they could use my wealth to save their decaying legacy. They thought they could humiliate my hardworking parents and treat me like disposable garbage. They had deeply underestimated the intelligence and the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of the woman they were trying to destroy. I turned off the lights in the bedroom and walked out of the penthouse, locking the door firmly behind me. I had a rehearsal dinner to attend. I had to play the glowing, blissful bride one last time. I had to look Richard in the eye and smile while he gave a toast to his historic bloodline. The countdown was in its final hours. The trap was perfectly set. The accounts were frozen. The evidence was queued for mass distribution. The foreclosure papers were drafted. All that was left to do was put on the white dress walk down the aisle and deliver the absolute fatal blow. I stepped into the private elevator, the brass doors sliding shut with a soft final chime. The descent down to the lobby felt smooth and incredibly fast. I was ready for war. I was ready to win. The walking ATM was officially out of service, and the corporate executioner was fully in charge. Let the games begin. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky that felt like a cruel cosmic joke to anyone expecting a tragedy. But for me, it was the absolute perfect lighting for a public execution. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my downtown hotel suite. I had not slept a single minute the night before, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made me feel entirely invincible. There was no white silk ball gown hanging in the room. There was no delicate lace veil or expensive pearl tiara waiting to be pinned into my hair. Those foolish, naive items had been packed away and donated to a local charity days ago. Instead, I was stepping into a razor-sharp, custom-tailored ivory power suit. It was the exact kind of suit a senior corporate director wears when she is about to ruthlessly dismantle a rival company and liquidate their assets. I buttoned the tailored jacket, smoothing the flawless, heavy fabric over my waist. I paired it with a simple silk camisole and lethal pointed toe stilettos. I applied my makeup with cold military precision, contouring my cheekbones and painting my lips a deep, confident shade of crimson. I did not look like a blushing bride eager to surrender her life and her bank accounts to a treacherous man. I looked like a woman who completely owned her destiny. I looked like a primary creditor about to collect a massive, outstanding debt. Thomas. My trusted corporate lawyer knocked on the suite door exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He stepped inside, wearing a dark charcoal suit and carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He looked at me and offered a tight, highly respectful nod. He told me the federal marshals were on standby and the final foreclosure documents were perfectly in order. He told me the proxy corporation had successfully secured the defaulted mortgage and that the bank had completely locked down Richard's accounts. He asked me if I was absolutely ready to pull the trigger on the Wellington family empire. I picked up my designer purse, ensuring my phone was fully charged and synced to the estate's audio-visual system. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had never been more ready for anything in my entire life. The drive to Wellington Estates was peaceful and incredibly quiet. We pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the property. The sprawling grounds were crawling with valets, parking luxury European cars, and event staff rushing to coordinate the final chaotic details. Jessica had spared absolutely no expense using my stolen corporate funds to build this mirage. The grand ballroom of the historic mansion had been transformed into a lavish spectacle of ridiculous excess. I could see the massive floral arches bursting with imported white orchids through the towering glass windows. The crystal chandeliers were glowing brightly, casting a warm, romantic light over the impending financial slaughterhouse. Inside the grand hall, 300 high society guests were taking their assigned seats. I knew exactly what they looked like. There were women dripping in diamonds and inherited pearls judging every single detail of the decor. There were men in tailored tuxedos sipping top-shelf bourbon and discussing their golf handicaps and stock portfolios. They were all gathered together, expecting to witness the glorious financial salvation of Richard and his precious aristocratic bloodline. They were waiting to see the naive, gullible farm girl walk down the aisle and cement her role as the walking ATM for the Wellington family. They thought they were attending a celebration of their own superiority. Spencer was standing at the front of the room at the elevated altar. Through the slightly parted wooden doors at the back of the hall, I watched him wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked incredibly nervous, but undeniably triumphant. He kept whispering to his best man, checking his expensive gold watch. He truly believed he had pulled it off. He thought the $730,000 corporate wire transfer was clearing into his account at that very moment. He thought his pregnant mistress was safely hidden in the background, orchestrating the catering staff. He thought his father was saved from total bankruptcy. He was basking in the arrogant glory of a man who thought he had successfully manipulated a powerful woman into financing his entire miserable existence. Richard was standing in the front row, his chest puffed out proudly, shaking hands with the wealthy investors he had invited to witness his so-called victory. He was smiling that same smug, condescending smile he wore when he called my parents street garbage. He was completely unaware that the ground he was standing on was no longer legally his property. The soft, elegant notes of a string quartet suddenly shifted into the traditional bridal chorus. The guests immediately fell silent and stood up from their velvet-covered chairs, turning their heads toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the hall. The anticipation in the room was thick and suffocating. I stood just outside the doors, taking one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool autumn air. Thomas stood firmly to my right, his hand gripping the handle of the briefcase that held their absolute destruction. I gave a sharp nod to the event staff. The heavy doors swung open. The collective gasp that instantly rippled through the massive ballroom sounded like all the air had been violently sucked out of the room. 300 pairs of eyes widened in utter, absolute shock. They expected to see a tearful, nervous bride, hiding behind a veil, holding a cascading bouquet of white roses. Instead, they saw me. I stood in the doorway, radiating a cold, terrifying authority. My ivory power suit stood out in stark, aggressive contrast to the sea of traditional pastel wedding attire. My stilettos clicked loudly against the polished marble floor as I took my first step into the hall. I was not walking down the aisle to give myself away to a manipulative coward. I was walking down the aisle to completely eviscerate a family of parasites. The string quartet faltered, a few of the musicians lowering their instruments in confusion before the cellist awkwardly tried to pick the melody back up. The disjointed, broken music only added to the terrifying, surreal atmosphere. I walked with slow, measured, purposeful steps. Thomas matched my pace, his presence adding an undeniable layer of corporate intimidation to the moment. I kept my chin high and my eyes locked dead ahead, refusing to show a single ounce of vulnerability. As I passed the rows of velvet chairs, I could hear the frantic, panicked whispers of the wealthy aunts and uncles. Aunt Beatrice dropped her silk program, her mouth hanging wide open in sheer disbelief. The pearl-clutching country club elites shifted uncomfortably, realizing instantly that something was horribly, catastrophically wrong. They whispered to each other, pointing at my suit and staring at the severe, unsmiling lawyer walking securely by my side. I glanced toward the side of the room and saw Jessica standing near the catering entrance. The smug, confident smile she had worn at the bridal shower was completely eradicated. Her hands were shaking visibly. She was clutching her clipboard, her knuckles totally white, staring at me with a creeping, dawning sense of terror. She knew I had caught her whispering her venomous threats, but she had no idea how deep my knowledge of her financial crimes actually went. I offered her a slow, chilling smile before returning my focus to the altar. I wanted her to know that her pristine little world was about to burn to the ground. Spencer was physically crumbling before my eyes. The triumphant arrogance melted off his face, leaving behind the pale, sweating mask of a desperate, terrified coward. He took a step forward, his hands trembling wildly at his sides. He looked at my power suit. He looked at Thomas and the heavy leather briefcase. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The reality of the situation was finally hitting him. The naive farm girl was entirely gone, and the corporate shark he had foolishly tried to exploit was currently swimming right toward him. Richard stepped out into the aisle, blocking my path, his face flushed an angry, dangerous shade of crimson. He raised his hand as if he was going to demand an explanation or order me to stop this ridiculous display. He opened his mouth to yell at me, to command me to respect his authority in his own home, but I did not even acknowledge his presence. I completely ignored the man who had treated me like disposable trash. I walked right past him, forcing him to step back or be trampled by my momentum. I left him sputtering in indignant, humiliated rage in front of all his wealthy friends. I reached the front of the grand hall. Spencer took another desperate step toward me, reaching out his hand in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "Caroline, what are you doing?" he whispered, his voice cracking in the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. "Where is your dress? What is going on? Why is your lawyer here?" I did not take his hand. I did not step up onto the elevated altar where the confused officiant was standing with his book open. I completely bypassed the altar altogether. I kept walking, my heels clicking a sharp final rhythm against the marble until I reached the raised platform on the left side of the room where the audio-visual and entertainment team was stationed. The sound engineer looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, stepping back from his soundboard. I reached out and calmly took the primary wireless microphone directly from his hands. I turned around to face the 300 guests. I stood on the platform looking out over the sea of confused, angry, and terrified faces. Spencer was staring at me, his entire body shaking as if he was standing in a freezing blizzard. Richard was frozen in place, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving with suppressed fury. Jessica was shrinking back against the wall, trying to hide in the shadows, completely terrified of the spotlight. Thomas stood calmly at the base of the platform, opening his briefcase. He unlocked the metal clasps with 2 loud, distinct clicks that echoed like gunshots through the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and held them ready at his side. I held the microphone up. I looked at the man I had once planned to marry. I looked at the family that had actively plotted to destroy my life and steal my hard-earned wealth. I looked at the high society guests who had looked down on my parents and judged my background. The room fell entirely, completely dead silent. You could have heard a single pin drop on the marble floor. The trap was perfectly sealed. The exits were blocked. There was absolutely no escape for anyone in the room. I took a deep breath, feeling the immense, absolute power of the moment settle into my bones. And I was finally ready to speak. I stood on the raised platform looking out at the sea of terrified faces. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute and so profound that I could hear the erratic, ragged breathing of the man who had planned to destroy my life. Spencer was completely frozen at the altar, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Richard stood in the front row, his chest heaving, his face locked in a mask of pure indignation and creeping panic. I brought the microphone close to my mouth and took a deep, steadying breath. My voice echoed through the massive hall, slicing through the heavy air with cold, lethal precision. I would like to welcome you all to the end of Wellington Estates. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the sheer gravity of my statement crashed down upon the crowd. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. Women in expensive pastel dresses clutched their pearl necklaces and turned to each other with wide, panicked eyes. Men in tailored tuxedos shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs, murmuring in confusion. Richard took a threatening step forward, his face flushing an ugly mottled shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to shout at me, to demand that security remove me from the premises, but my voice cut him off entirely. I turned my head slightly and gave a single sharp nod to the sound engineer standing trembling in the corner of the booth. He swallowed hard and pressed the master execution button on his control board, just as we had planned. Instantly, the heavy velvet curtains behind the altar parted, revealing 3 massive digital projection screens that spanned the entire width of the grand hall. The projectors hummed to life, flooding the darkened room with a stark, blinding white light. The center screen illuminated first, displaying a highly magnified, crystal-clear image of a text message thread. The names at the top of the conversation were perfectly visible to every single person in the room. Spencer and Jessica. The crowd leaned forward, squinting at the bright display. And then they began to read the cruel, malicious words that had shattered my world just a few days ago. The messages were completely unedited and entirely undeniable. Did she sign the prenup yet? We need that $730,000 to save your dad's estate before the bank forecloses. Once the money clears, you can dump the farm girl, and we will raise our son in the estate. A wave of horrified murmurs erupted across the ballroom. The wealthy aunts who had judged my background now stared at Spencer in absolute sheer disgust. The country club elites who had praised Richard's historic legacy were suddenly whispering about bankruptcy and fraud. Then, the screen on the left flared to life. It displayed the black and white medical ultrasound photo. The patient named Jessica Sutton was highlighted in a bright yellow digital marker, along with the gestational age of 14 weeks. All eyes instantly darted from the massive screen to Jessica, who was still cowering near the catering entrance. Her face was ashen, and she was visibly shaking, gripping the edge of a banquet table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The elegant high society guests parted away from her, like the Red Sea completely isolating the pregnant mistress in a circle of profound social condemnation. But I was not finished. The screen on the right flashed green, and a mountain of highly sensitive financial documents flooded the display. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice ringing with undeniable authority, guiding the stunned crowd through the evidence. What you are looking at on the right, I announced, my gaze sweeping across the paralyzed audience, are the actual internal financial ledgers of Wellington Estates. For the past year, Spencer Wellington has been siphoning thousands of dollars every single month from his failing family business into a fake floral company registered to his mistress. He was using stolen corporate funds to finance a luxury apartment, while his father actively evaded federal payroll taxes. The ballroom descended into total, utter chaos. The polite whispers turned into loud, angry shouts. Investors who had loaned Richard money began standing up, pointing furiously at the screens. The entire illusion of the pristine, untouchable Wellington bloodline was being ripped apart, piece by tiny piece, broadcast live for the entire world to witness. Spencer finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. The reality of his absolute destruction crashed into him, and a look of primal, desperate panic took over his features. He let out a loud, furious scream and lunged off the altar, sprinting directly toward the audio-visual platform. He intended to rip the microphone from my hands and violently smash the soundboard. "Turn it off," he roared, his face twisted in ugly, terrifying rage. "Turn it off right now, Caroline. You are crazy. This is all a lie." He did not make it past the first row of chairs. Thomas had anticipated this exact reaction. From the shadows of the side aisles, 4 massive, highly trained private security contractors stepped forward. They moved with lightning speed and flawless precision. 2 of the men intercepted Spencer, grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him violently against the polished marble floor. He struggled and thrashed against their grip, kicking his expensive leather shoes in the air, but he was completely immobilized. He looked incredibly small and entirely pathetic, pinned to the ground beneath the heavy boots of professional security guards. Richard was standing near the front row, watching his son being tackled to the floor and his entire financial history being broadcast to his peers. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn for decades melted away completely. His face turned a sickly, pale shade of gray. He reached a trembling hand up to his chest, clutching the lapel of his expensive rented tuxedo. He staggered backward, his knees buckling as he hit the edge of a velvet chair. He was gasping for air, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The realization that his precious legacy was permanently destroyed was physically breaking him. I stepped down from the platform, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, completely ignoring the chaotic shouting of the guests. The crowd parted for me, their faces painted with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. I was the executioner, and they were watching me deliver the final blow. I stopped right in front of Richard, who was still clutching his chest and leaning heavily against the chair. Thomas walked silently beside me, holding the thick leather briefcase. He clicked the metal latches open and handed me a heavy stack of legal documents bound in thick blue folders. I held the documents out toward Richard. My voice was no longer amplified by the microphone, but the icy, lethal tone carried perfectly through the sudden quiet that had fallen over the front of the room. "You called my family street garbage, Richard." I said my words, slicing through his fragile ego like a sharpened blade. "You looked at my hardworking parents and decided they were entirely beneath your historic pedigree. You thought you could use me as a financial shield to save your bankrupt, decaying empire." Richard tried to speak, his voice a weak, strangled rasp. "Caroline, please." He begged, his arrogant pride completely eradicated. "Please do not do this. We can fix this. We can come to an arrangement." "There is no arrangement," I replied, dropping the heavy stack of foreclosure documents directly onto his lap. The papers spilled open, revealing the official bank seals and the transfer of ownership clauses. "But it turns out I own your estate now. My private investment firm purchased your defaulted commercial debt yesterday afternoon. I am your sole creditor, and I am officially calling in your loans." Richard's eyes widened in absolute horror as he looked down at the documents. He saw my signature on the bottom line. The reality of his situation crushed whatever fight he had left in him. "You are completely bankrupt, Richard." I continued, my voice devoid of any mercy or compassion. "The corporate contract was permanently voided days ago. The accounts you tried to hide offshore have been frozen by a federal fraud alert. You have absolutely nothing left. And you have exactly 30 days to vacate my property before I send the marshals to throw you out on the street." A loud wail echoed from the back of the room. Jessica had sunk to her knees, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The wealthy aunts and cousins were practically running toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the spectacular criminal implosion of the Wellington family. They wanted nothing to do with a man who was about to lose his home and his freedom. Spencer was still pinned to the floor by the security guards, crying loudly and begging for me to listen to him. "Caroline, I love you," he sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically across the marble floor. "She means nothing to me. The baby was a mistake. Please just give me another chance. We can still get married. We can still have a perfect life." I looked down at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. "You never loved me, Spencer," I said, my tone chillingly flat. "You loved my credit limit, and now your accounts are permanently closed." Right at that exact moment, the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the grand hall flew open with a loud, violent crash. The remaining guests gasped and scrambled out of the way as a team of 12 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers marched into the ballroom. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency, fanning out across the room to secure the exits. The lead agent, a tall, intimidating man with a silver badge clipped to his belt, walked directly down the center aisle toward the altar. He stopped in front of Richard, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were actually chattering. Richard Wellington, the federal agent, announced, his deep voice booming across the silent hall. "We have federal warrants for your arrest on multiple counts of corporate tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering." Two agents stepped forward and grabbed Richard's arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. They pulled his hands behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the room. Richard did not fight them. He just hung his head, tears of absolute humiliation streaming down his gray, wrinkled face. The man who had obsessed over his public image was now being paraded in front of his wealthy peers as a common criminal. The lead agent turned his attention to the floor, where Spencer was still being held by my security team. Spencer Wellington. The agent continued pulling a second pair of handcuffs from his belt. You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal tax evasion. The private security guard stepped back, allowing the federal agents to haul Spencer off the floor. Spencer was screaming and crying, thrashing against the agents as they locked the steel cuffs around his wrists. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, pleading for me to save him, to tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. But I just stood there, perfectly still, my arms crossed over the front of my tailored ivory suit, watching the justice I had meticulously orchestrated unfold right in front of me. I had warned him that I would rather be street garbage than be legally tied to a family of bankrupt leeches. Now, he was going to experience exactly what it felt like to have everything stripped away. Another pair of agents had already reached the back of the room where Jessica was still sobbing on the floor. They pulled her up, reading her rights, and placing her in handcuffs as a known accomplice to the financial conspiracy. The sweet, innocent wedding planner was going to spend the foreseeable future answering federal questions about her fraudulent floral company. The federal agents began marching the three of them down the long center aisle toward the main exit. The wealthy guests stood in absolute stunned silence, watching the total destruction of the Wellington family. No one offered to help them. No one spoke up in their defense. They just stared wide-eyed and terrified as the reality of the situation sunk in. I stood at the front of the empty altar, Thomas standing silently by my side. The massive digital screens behind us were still broadcasting the undeniable evidence of their crimes, illuminating the room with a cold, harsh light. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind the federal agents, taking Spencer, Richard, and Jessica out of my life permanently. The grand hall was suddenly incredibly quiet, leaving only the lingering whispers of the shocked guests and the faint sound of police sirens wailing in the distance. I had lost a fiancé and a massive amount of time to a family of deceptive predators, but I had gained something far more valuable. I had protected my hard-earned wealth. I had defended the honor of my hardworking parents, and I had secured the ultimate, absolute victory over the people who had tried to destroy me. I turned to Thomas and offered him a genuine, tired smile. The war was officially over. Let us go home, Thomas. I said, my voice soft but incredibly strong. We have a lot of property renovations to plan. I walked down the aisle one last time, my head held high, my steps steady and confident. I pushed through the side doors and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, leaving the crumbling ruins of the Wellington legacy far behind me. I was completely free, and I had absolutely never felt more powerful. Women can sacrifice, but we should never, ever be foolish. When backed into a corner, show them your true, absolute strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. 6 months passed since the day the Grand Hall of Wellington Estates became the stage for absolute justice. The crisp autumn air had slowly surrendered to the bitter, freezing cold of a brutal Chicago winter before finally giving way to the bright, hopeful warmth of spring. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse, watching the city wake up far below me. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the calm waters of Lake Michigan. I took a slow, deep breath of the fresh, circulating air, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settled deep into my bones. The suffocating anxiety and the dark, crushing weight of betrayal were completely gone. I was no longer the exhausted corporate director, desperately trying to please a family of greedy, arrogant snobs. I was a free woman who had successfully navigated the most treacherous financial battlefield of my entire life. The legal fallout from the wedding day disaster was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Richard and Spencer did not stand a chance against the mountain of undeniable digital evidence I had meticulously handed over to the federal authorities. The trial was a highly publicized media circus that captivated the entire city. The arrogant men who had obsessed over their pristine public image were paraded through the federal courthouse in standard-issue prison jumpsuits. Their trial lasted less than 3 weeks. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the financial discrepancies were simple accounting errors, but the recorded audio files and the offshore wire transfers proved severe malicious intent. The judge handed down his sentence with cold, unwavering authority. Richard Wellington, the man who had called my hardworking parents street garbage, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate tax evasion and wire fraud. His health quickly deteriorated in the harsh prison environment, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of his country club pride. Spencer faced an equally devastating reality. The spoiled entitled heir who had begged on his knees for my money was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering. He lost his tailored designer suits and his expensive imported cars. He lost the comfortable, luxurious lifestyle he had completely taken for granted. He was forced to trade his fancy country club dinners for the bleak, isolated reality of a concrete cell. I heard from Thomas, my corporate lawyer, that Spencer cried audibly when the guilty verdict was read. He finally realized that his immense arrogance and his cowardly manipulations had entirely destroyed his own future. He had tried to play me for a naive fool, but he ended up orchestrating his own complete and total downfall. And then there was Jessica, the sweet, bubbly wedding planner who had so desperately wanted to secure her place in high society, quickly realized that the Wellington fortune was nothing but a massive illusion. When the federal agents froze all the accounts and seized the offshore shell companies, her entire dream of effortless wealth vanished into thin air. She was interrogated by federal prosecutors for days, desperately trying to avoid prison time by shifting all the blame onto Spencer and Richard. When she realized there was absolutely no money left to steal, she did exactly what a greedy opportunist does best. She packed a small bag and fled the state, completely abandoning Spencer to face his federal sentence entirely alone. She moved out west, changing her phone number and leaving behind the chaotic ruins of her failed gold-digging scheme. Spencer was left rotting in a prison cell, entirely abandoned by the pregnant mistress he had risked everything to protect. With the toxic leeches permanently removed from my life, I focused all my sharp corporate energy on the massive asset I had acquired. Wellington Estates was officially mine. As the primary creditor, I had successfully executed the foreclosure documents, stripping the Wellington family of their historic ancestral home. I did not want to keep the sprawling, decaying mansion. The property held too many dark, repulsive memories of fake smiles and condescending insults. I immediately hired a prestigious commercial real estate firm to completely liquidate the asset. The property was situated on prime suburban land, making it highly desirable for luxury commercial developers. We sold the massive estate to a prominent hospitality group that planned to tear down the rotting mansion and build a state-of-the-art wellness resort. The sale was incredibly lucrative. The sheer immense profit from liquidating the estate completely doubled my initial investment. I took the $730,000 that Spencer had tried to steal and multiplied it into a massive, overwhelming fortune. I stood on the sprawling stone portico on the very last day before the demolition crews arrived. I looked out over the grand driveway where Spencer had once begged on his knees. The gravel crunched softly beneath my designer heels. I felt absolutely no sadness watching the heavy machinery roll onto the pristine green lawns. I was simply clearing away the heavy, toxic debris of a terrible mistake to make room for something completely new. I decided that the massive profit from the estate sale should not just sit idle in my bank accounts. I wanted to transform their greedy, fraudulent legacy into something truly powerful and inherently good. I worked closely with Thomas to establish a comprehensive charitable foundation dedicated entirely to supporting hardworking, working-class women. I wanted to help women who came from modest backgrounds just like my parents to achieve their dreams without ever feeling inferior to the wealthy elite. The foundation provided massive educational scholarships, professional mentorship programs, and critical financial grants to women striving to build their own independent businesses. Every time I signed a massive grant check, I thought about Richard Wellington and his pathetic, snobby sister, Aunt Beatrice. I used their precious generational wealth to empower the exact same people they had spent their entire lives looking down upon. It was the most perfect, beautiful, poetic justice I could have ever possibly imagined. My personal life underwent a massive, beautiful transformation as well. I sold the dark, expensive penthouse that Spencer and I had shared. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with the custom Italian furniture and the cold, modern art he had selected. I purchased a stunning, bright new penthouse located right in the vibrant, beating heart of downtown Chicago. My new home featured massive, towering windows that flooded the rooms with warm, natural sunlight. I decorated the space myself, choosing comfortable, plush furniture and vibrant, colorful art that brought me genuine joy. There was no fake pretension in my new home. It was a space built entirely on authenticity, independence, and profound financial freedom. I spent my evenings reading books and drinking hot tea, completely unbothered by the fake high society drama that had previously consumed my life. My parents visited me often, and we laughed together, enjoying the simple, beautiful moments of life. They were so incredibly proud of the woman I had become. They saw how I had taken a devastating heartbreak and turned it into a powerful source of immense personal growth. The pain of the past was completely washed away, leaving behind a polished, shining version of myself. I knew my worth, and I knew I would never again allow anyone to treat me as less than absolute royalty. I stood on my sprawling private balcony, breathing in the cool evening air. The glittering lights of the Chicago skyline stretched out infinitely before me, shining like a million tiny diamonds against the dark night sky. The city felt alive and buzzing with infinite possibilities. I thought about the farm girl who had moved to the city 10 years ago, full of naive dreams and blind trust. I thought about the devastating heartbreak and the towering, fiery rage that had completely consumed me when I saw that ultrasound photo on the silver iPad. The journey through the darkness had been incredibly painful and intensely exhausting, but it had forged me into an absolutely unbreakable force of nature. The trial memories sometimes drifted back into my mind, but they held absolutely no power over me anymore. I remembered seeing Spencer in the courtroom, looking at me with desperate, sad eyes. He had wanted me to save him one last time. He had wanted me to testify on his behalf and tell the judge that he was just a confused man manipulated by his father. But I had sat in the gallery with my head held high, completely ignoring his pathetic, silent pleas. I had provided the documents that sealed his fate, and I felt a deep, profound satisfaction knowing the truth had finally been brought to the light. The justice system had worked perfectly, delivering the exact punishment they both deserved. Jessica fleeing the state was the most predictable part of the entire ordeal. She was a coward who ran at the first sign of real trouble. She thought she was so incredibly smart, whispering cruel threats into my ear at the bridal shower. She thought she had secured a lifetime of wealth and privilege by targeting a weak man. But her entire scheme unraveled the moment I intercepted that massive offshore wire transfer. She was left with absolutely nothing but a ruined reputation and a constant lingering fear of federal prosecution. I never bothered to look for her. She was entirely irrelevant to my beautiful new life. The foundation I built continued to grow every single day. We hosted large community events and awarded massive grants to brilliant, aspiring female entrepreneurs. I met incredibly inspiring women who had survived terrible hardships and built their own successful companies from the ground up. Hearing their stories made my own pain feel so small and distant. I was surrounded by a community of strong, intelligent, independent women who lifted each other up instead of tearing each other down. I had replaced the toxic country club snobs with a circle of genuine supportive friends. The wellness resort that replaced Wellington Estates was finally completed. The grand opening was a beautiful, successful event. The dark, dreary mansion was gone completely, replaced by a stunning modern facility dedicated to health and healing. I drove past the property once just to see the transformation. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere that used to hang over the estate was completely eradicated. The grounds were filled with beautiful, lush gardens and tranquil water features. It was a physical representation of my own personal journey from toxic darkness into bright, radiant light. I finally understood that the universe has a very precise way of balancing the scales. The people who operate with greed and malice eventually face the devastating consequences of their own actions. The people who act with integrity and strength are ultimately rewarded with peace and absolute true freedom. I had endured the darkest storm of my entire life and emerged on the other side completely victorious. They mistook my kindness for stupidity and my silence for weakness. They thought they could use my heart as a stepping stone to save their bankrupt empire. They believed that because I loved fiercely, I would forgive blindly. But a woman's true strength is not in how loud she screams, it is in how methodically she rebuilds her life from the ashes. I did not just survive their betrayal. I completely dismantled their entire world and used the broken pieces to build my own glorious empire. I was no longer a walking ATM for a family of cowardly leeches. I was the absolute master of my own destiny, standing tall and victorious in the beautiful glowing light of my own hard-earned success. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.